You wake to the sound of voices drifting over the low stone wall outside your door. The sun has only just begun to light the narrow lane, its pale gold touching the tops of the fig trees. You step into your sandals and push the door open slowly, letting the cool air slip into the room before you step out. The wall is warm from years of leaning and gossiping against it, though this morning it still holds the night's coolness. Your neighbor's voice carries easily in the stillness. She is talking about the wedding menu again, as though it were a mystery as vast as the sea. Olives, of course, she says, and lamb. Everyone knows these will be there. But the question is, the sweet, will it be almond biscuits or the sticky honey pastries? This is the third morning she has speculated about it, and the week is only just beginning. The smell of coffee drifts from another doorway, thick and bitter, mixing with the faint salt scent from the harbor. The stones beneath your feet are cool and smooth, worn flat by countless footsteps. You rest your elbows on the wall, feeling its slight tilt, its rough whitewash chipped where boys have sat swinging their legs. Across the way, a small group of women gather in the lane's bend, speaking in low tones that occasionally burst into laughter. One holds a bunch of fresh herbs, their green sharpness cutting through the heavier smells. Someone mentions the rumor about a cousin arriving uninvited, though uninvited in this village never truly means unwelcome. A donkey passes, its hooves clinking on stone, carrying 2 sacks of flour that sway with each step. The baker has already been awake for hours, they say, and his oven has been glowing since before dawn. The smoke from his chimney is faint but steady, rising against the pale sky. You can hear the dull thump of kneading from behind his shutters, rhythmic as a heartbeat. Historians still argue whether the gossip that fills mornings like this was mainly about food, or if it was equally about alliances, debts, and favors owed. Some say the menu was just the safe surface of the conversation, with the real matters tucked underneath. But here now, it feels simple people leaning on walls, sipping coffee, waiting for bread, and speaking of pastries. A boy runs past, his bare feet silent, a folded note in his hand. He is sent to fetch someone's cousin, or perhaps just to deliver another opinion about the sweets. The wall warms a little more as the sun climbs, and you let your hand rest on it, tracing the cracks in the plaster. The talk drifts from food to the weather, to whether the breeze will be strong enough to keep flies away from the tables. No one is in a hurry to move. The wedding is days away, and for now there is only this steady leaning, this gentle exchange over the wall. You follow the smell before you follow your feet. It threads through the lane like a thin ribbon, warm and persuasive, already softening the air that still clings tonight. The baker's courtyard is open, as it always is, on mornings that matter. You pause beneath the grapevine trellis, where a few sleepy wasps toddle over the rough green skin of the fruit, and let the heat from the oven roll over you in slow breaths. The dome has been fired since the small hours. The baker's son keeps nudging embers with a charred branch, coaxing a steady glow from the heart of the ash. Inside, the women move as though they have rehearsed this scene for years, which they have. Flour blooms from their hands in pale puffs, dusting wrists, elbows, even the wisps of hair that have escaped their kerchiefs. A wide wooden trough waits at the center of everything, smoothed by generations of kneading. You place your palms against it for a moment, feeling the faint slickness of olive oil rubbed into the grain to keep the dough from clinging too hard. Someone hands you a bowl of warm water, and you feel the steam rest on your cheeks. Someone else tips in a living scoop of sour starter, the same prosimy that was fed yesterday, and the day before, and the week before that. A quiet creature that eats and breathes, passed down like a story. The first fold is always slow. You push the dough away, draw it back, turn it, breathe, and repeat. The motion is as gentle as a lullaby that doesn't need words. A girl hums anyway, a long line of sound that keeps time better than the baker's son does. The dough begins to wake, becoming elastic, taking on that agreeable weight that sits right in your hands. It smells faintly sour, faintly sweet, like a memory of grapes and rain. A fact sits in the warm air as plainly as the oven. In villages like this across 19th century Greece, wedding weeks stretch work into ceremony, and bread stands at the center of it, daily loaves for feeding the abundance of mouths, and special holiday shapes for displaying generosity and luck. You hear someone mention the gamassimo, the wedding bread that will be braided and decorated later, dressed with sesame and perhaps a few tiny birds or grape leaves, pressed from dough, as if the loaf had grown a garden. For now, though, it's the first plain batch, the everyday crust that will go with olives, with cheese, with the usual arguments about whether the lamb should be heavily salted or simply kissed by smoke. A woman brushes her fingertips with oil and smooths the surface of the dough, like calming a restless child. She makes a sign habit, not spectacle, and then grins at you for catching her in it. She tells you in a half-whisper that in her grandmother's house, they used to tuck a single clean coin deep into one loaf on the first day of wedding week. Whoever found it was said to carry the couple's luck in their pocket for a year. You imagine someone biting carefully, then perhaps biting less carefully, and you smile into the dough. Another neighbor swears by setting a sprig of basil under the rising bowl to keep envy from crawling in with the heat. It is the sort of tidbit that floats around kitchens like a stray sesame seed fringe to some, necessary to others, and nobody bothers to settle the question. The oven door opens with a soft scrape, and the day leans forward to look inside. You watch the baker test the floor with a pinch of flour. It jumps brown, then black, then he nods, satisfied that the heat is right. He rakes the embers aside into a glowing crescent and swabs the bricks with a damp cloth tied to a long handle, making a hiss that sounds like a sigh. You shape loaves the size of 2 hands and line them up on a board dusted with barley flour, because barley, stubborn, reliable, has long shared the table with wheat in poorer years. Your thumb presses a shallow dimple in each loaf to keep the crust from wandering too far as it rises. You scatter sesame with lazy precision, and because you are secretly hungry already, you lick a fingertip and taste a single seed. Historians still argue whether specific kneading songs belonged to wedding weeks, or whether they were simply the familiar work songs dragged along to any heavy task that needed steady arms. Some say the wedding made its own music in the lanes and the courtyards, and the dough listened like everyone else. Others name verses, fragments of them, insisting they were meant for days exactly like this, when the village pulled together like a braid. You decide the dough doesn't mind either way. It just wants that rhythm, the firm patience of hands, the warmth that feels like intention. The first board of loaves goes in with a neat shove and a quick twist of the wrist. You lean on the long wooden peel and feel the oven's breath rise up the handle into your palms. Outside, roosters announce and re-announce morning, as though the sun needs constant encouragement to keep climbing. In the street, a cluster of children count loaves in loud whispers and pretend to keep track, although soon they will be bored and slide into a game that makes them forget to be helpful. You can hear the sea beginning to talk to the stones along the quay, a faint shuffling that sounds like someone settling a blanket over their knees. While the loaves take, you turn to the smaller shapes. There will be little rings for dipping, a tray of knotted rolls, and a few plump twists meant for the bride's younger cousins to carry around as edible trophies. You roll ropes of dough under your palms and feel how it answers you pliant, a little damp, watchful. A neighbor brings in a narrow jar of olive oil, flecked with rosemary. She dips a brush of thyme stems into it and streaks each roll with a line that will bake into a thin gleam. Another neighbor, he is more practical than poetic, asks whether the baker will sharpen the bread knife today or wait until after the wedding, since there is a vague superstition that sharpening blades on the week of a marriage makes tongues too sharp as well. Everyone pretends not to find that persuasive, but nobody offers him a whetstone either. The first bake comes out, and the courtyard changes color. Crusts bloom from pale to a patient brown, then to a deeper, shining chestnut, where sesame has toasted. A line cracks along one loaf like a smile. Steam escapes and lays a soft hand on your face. You tap the bottom with a knuckle, listening for that hollow note that says, yes, this is finished. This will carry butter and talk. This will go down easy after a late night of song. You stack the loaves on the woven baskets that wait in a wobbling tower, and the baskets gossip too, creaking under the heat. Someone counts how many mouths slept in the neighborhood last night, and how many more might arrive before dusk. The numbers do not behave. They edge upward each time an aunt remembers another cousin. Each time a boat appears as a small punctuation mark out past the headland. You set aside extra dough because numbers in wedding week do not obey plans, and because feeding more than expected is its own quiet pleasure. If you must stretch, you will stretch, If the last loaves are thinner, no one will complain with a full mouth. By the time the third board slides into the oven, the courtyard smells like a promise that has already been kept. You wipe flour on your apron and find a corner to stand in, just out of the path of elbows, listening to the soft thuds and low voices. Your hands feel pleasantly tired, your wrists warm. A bead of sweat runs down your temple and tastes faintly of salt when you catch it with your tongue. On a day like this, surviving wedding week begins with the simplest mercy hot bread in arm's reach, and the knowledge that, when the songs go late, there will be something solid to hold the wine in place. You take a heel from the first loaf, because the baker nods, because the law of first pieces favors whoever is nearest, and you chew slowly as the crust murmurs between your teeth. The world narrows to warmth, to sesame, to the way the crumb springs gently back from your bite, and you feel the day settle into its proper shape. The sun has begun to angle more boldly into the lane by the time you leave the baker's courtyard. The heat is not yet sharp, but it holds the promise of an afternoon that will press its palm firmly on your back. You pass under a fig tree, whose branches have leaned toward the street for so many years that the trunk has twisted like a rope. A low cart stands by your neighbor's door, its wooden wheels resting in shallow grooves worn into the stone. The cart is stacked with chairs, some straight-backed and sturdy, others faintly apologetic in their wobble roped together in pairs for easier carrying. You know where these are headed. The courtyard of the bride's family cannot hold them all. But in wedding week, every seat that can be borrowed will be borrowed. Even the most unsociable chairs, the ones usually banished to a shadowy corner of a storage room, will be coaxed into service. It is a matter of simple necessity. People cannot dance all night without somewhere to drop for a moment and mutter about their feet. And there is pride in lending, too. A wedding that overflows its chairs is remembered differently than one where the guests must stand. Two men lift a bench between them, the wood worn pale at the edges where hands have always gripped it. They call to a boy to bring another rope. The bench swings a little as it is tied into the cart, thumping once before settling into place. You add your own contribution, a short stool with a seat woven from reed, its pattern a little loose in one corner. You give it a pat as though it were an old mule and watch it vanish beneath a taller chair. A plain fact, as dry and solid as the chairs themselves. In 19th century Greek villages, weddings were sprawling community affairs, often spilling beyond the family courtyard into the lanes. Furniture moved like borrowed words from one household to another, each piece carrying the memory of other feasts, other guests, other evenings when someone sat in it and listened to the same songs. The lane becomes a slow parade of borrowed legs, three-legged stools, benches long enough for six, low chairs that require a dignified effort to stand up from. You notice how each bearer carries their load differently. One man rests the chair upside down on his shoulder like a peculiar crown. Another uses his hip as a temporary shelf. A woman, small but determined, tucks a footstool under each arm and marches ahead without looking back. You hear a story, half-truth, half-exaggeration, that once a wedding in a neighboring village had so many guests that someone was obliged to carry a church pew into the courtyard. The pew did not fit neatly against the tables, and several people spent the evening sitting rigidly side by side, unable to turn without bumping elbows. The story makes its rounds every year, and no one bothers to settle whether it is strictly accurate. Historians would likely call it a matter of oral tradition, and oral tradition is no more concerned with dimensions than it is with chronology. The cart moves slowly toward the bride's house, accompanied by a trail of chatter and the occasional squeak of rope tightening under weight. You follow at a lazy pace, enjoying how the procession makes the lane feel narrower, more intimate, as though the buildings have leaned in to listen. A neighbor stops you to ask if your cousin will be lending the tall ladder for the decorations. You answer vaguely, knowing the ladder is missing one rung, and silently hoping the question will drift elsewhere before it is decided that you should repair it in the heat of the afternoon. At the bride's courtyard, the chairs are stacked in one corner like obedient animals awaiting their turn. Some are arranged immediately in a row, their legs wobbling slightly on the uneven flagstones, ready for the first wave of visitors who will come simply to watch the preparations. Others are stored away, to be brought out as the night lengthens and fatigue replaces formality. One man taps a chair leg against the stone to check its steadiness. then shrugs and sets it aside for later repair. You notice him pocket a small wedge of wood. He will tap it into place when no one is watching, and then claim the chair was sturdy all along. Such small repairs are part of the ritual quiet acts that prepare the stage without drawing applause. As the last chair is unroped, the cart stands empty, its bed faintly marked by the shapes of the seats it carried. The smell of dust and sun-warmed wood drifts from it. The men lean against the courtyard wall, hands on hips, looking as though they have completed a grand feat. You know the real work has barely begun. But for this moment, it is enough to stand still and feel the weight of the day shift forward into readiness. Historians still argue whether these acts of lending were purely practical, or whether they carried the weight of subtle negotiations who owed whom, who would be reminded of their generosity when the next favor was needed. In truth, it is both. The chairs serve the guests, but they also speak for the household that lent them, each seat a quiet claim to a place in the village's memory of the wedding. When the cart finally rattles away, heading back to collect more, you linger in the courtyard shade. Your stool is there, barely visible among the stack, waiting for some stranger's weight. You wonder who will sit on it, whether they will notice the loosened weave, whether they will care. Probably not. By the time anyone sits, the music will have loosened more than the stool ever could, and the night will be too far along for such details to matter. The courtyard smells faintly of thyme and newly swept stone. Somewhere beyond the next wall, the baker's loaves are cooling, the air above them trembling with warmth. You turn back toward your own lane, passing the fig tree again, the heat at its base richer now, and feel the morning gathering itself like fabric being folded for the next task. You find the lane narrower now, not because the stones have shifted, but because white sheets sway from ropes strung overhead, low enough to make you duck in certain stretches. The air is caught between them, warm but restless, moving in little drafts that stir the fabric into slow billowing breaths. You follow the rows of damp linen until you reach the yard where several women are pegging the last corners into place. The pegs are simple wooden pins, worn smooth from years of being twisted and pressed between fingers. A plain truth: in 19th century Greek villages, laundry during wedding week was not just for cleanliness, it was for spectacle. Every visible cloth would be freshly washed, the white linen declaring to neighbors and visitors that the household was orderly, generous, and ready to host. Even the older pieces, thin in the middle and patched at the edges, would be scrubbed and hung so they caught the sun just right. You take a basket from the low wall, its handles darkened where wet palms have gripped them, and hand up a folded sheet to the woman on the stool. She shakes it hard, sending droplets flying like a brief, fine rain. The cloth slaps against the rope and settles, the faint smell of lye soap rising in the sunlight. Someone hums, the same fragment of melody repeated with no urgency, only enough to keep the work moving at the pace the morning allows. From the other side of the yard comes the sound of water sloshing. Two girls lift a tub together, their bare feet slipping slightly on the packed earth. They pour the soapy water into the drain channel that runs along the wall, and it disappears under a hinged wooden cover. A neighbor leans over to watch, remarking on the color of the water, half joking, half serious, before wandering off toward the smell of bread cooling somewhere nearby. You pin another edge, feeling the grain of the cloth beneath your fingers. It is coarse in some places, smoother in others where years of washing have worn the fibers fine. The sun catches the weave and throws thin shadows across your hand. A chicken wanders through, stepping on the edge of a sheet that brushes the ground, leaving a faint dusty print before it is shooed away. One of the women tells you that when she was a girl, her grandmother would hang the wedding linens only at night, so the morning dew could whiten them further. Another laughs and says that is nonsense, that dew only leaves spots, but admits she has never dared to try. Historians still argue whether such methods were widespread, or simply local habits passed down and altered in each family. Some say dew was prized for bleaching. Others insist it was merely a poetic detail added in the retelling of old days. The sheet swayed gently, catching the salt in the air from the sea just beyond the hill. You can almost see the taste of it, bright and clean, settling into the fabric. One by one, the ropes fill until the yard becomes a maze of white walls, shifting and breathing. The narrow paths between them feel like small private corridors where voices are hushed and footsteps soften. You step through one such path and emerge into a patch of sunlight where a single embroidered cloth hangs apart from the rest. Its border is stitched with red and black threads in a repeating pattern of small birds and vine. It is not new. Some of the threads have faded, and one corner has been repaired with a slightly different red. But it will be laid on a table during the wedding feast, a mark of care and continuity. The work slows as the last pieces are pegged. Hands rest on hips, eyes turn upward to the bright rectangles swaying overhead. Someone remarks that the breeze is just right today, enough to keep the air moving, not enough to pull the pins loose. You think about how tomorrow the sheets will be dry, folded, and stored. But for now, they are part of the week's quiet theater, telling anyone who passes that something is about to happen here. You leave the yard through a narrow side gate, stepping over a low threshold, worn smooth by generations of bare feet. The sunlight in the lane feels sharper now, and you blink, carrying with you the cool whiteness of the linen maze. Somewhere a donkey brays as if impatient for its own part in the preparations, and you follow the sound, ready to see where the next task is unfolding. You hear them before you see them, the uneven thud of footsteps on the stone quay, the scrape of a crate being set down too quickly, the creak of leather straps shifting under weight. When you reach the harbor's edge, the boat is already tied up, its bow lifting and settling with the small, lazy waves. It is one of the island ferries, not grand enough to impress, but steady enough to trust. Its paint faded to a color that could be called blue, if one were in a generous mood. The deck smells of tar, fish, and sun-baked rope. A line of relatives trickles down the plank, each one carrying something that says they are here for a wedding, baskets with cloths tied over their contents, boxes that give off faint smells of dried fruit, bottles whose shapes are instantly recognizable, even without labels. Some travelers wear expressions of relief, happy to have crossed the short stretch of sea. Others look faintly windblown, as though still adjusting to the ground beneath their feet. You greet them in the slow manner that wedding week allows. A nod, a clasp of the shoulder, a remark about the weather's cooperation. One man insists on shaking your hand twice, as though the first time might not have counted. He has been away long enough that he wants the moment to be recorded in the memory of everyone standing nearby. A woman calls your name, balancing a small child on her hip, and leans in to kiss both your cheeks before setting the child down to run in delighted circles on the quay. A plain fact: in many Greek island villages during the 19th century, relatives might arrive several days early for a wedding, not only to ensure their presence, but to take part in the long sequence of preparations. They came with both gifts and labor, ready to carry wood, wash vegetables, braid hair, or simply fill the air with talk that made the work lighter. One cousin, barely recognizable beneath the brim of a broad straw hat, carries a sack of walnuts slung over his shoulder. Another relative has a pair of pigeons in a wicker cage, their restless shifting making the thin sticks creak. Someone jokes that the birds are here to attend the ceremony as honored guests, though you know they will likely be part of a dish that will appear on one of the many tables in the days ahead. The ferry's deckhands begin hauling out the larger cargo, a rolled rug, a crate of clay amphorae sealed with wax, a bundle of long reeds tied neatly with rope. A boy tries to lift one amphora and quickly sets it back down with a grunt, looking around to see who noticed. His grandmother clucks her tongue and tells him to fetch something more suitable to his size. Historians still argue whether arrivals like this were carefully coordinated in advance, or whether they simply happened as soon as the weather permitted. Some records suggest that messengers were sent weeks ahead. Others hint that the appearance of relatives was a mix of planning and luck, dependent on which boats happened to run, and who could be persuaded to leave their own harvest or market duties. From where you stand, it seems less like scheduling and more like the slow, inevitable gathering of a tide. You help carry a basket covered with a clean white cloth, warm to the touch from sitting in the sun during the crossing. The woman who hands it to you whispers that it holds small cheese pies made early this morning, and that they are to be kept aside until the second day of celebrations. You nod solemnly, as though you are being entrusted with something both delicate and important, which you are. As the group makes its way from the harbor into the narrow uphill lanes, the rhythm of their steps changes. The stone underfoot is different here, less worn, more uneven, and the bundles they carry begin to feel heavier. You walk alongside an older man who has brought a stack of bright copper plates, their edges catching the light in brief flashes. He tells you, with obvious pride, that these belong to his grandmother and have been at the table of every family wedding for 3 generations. Children dart ahead, eager to be the first to reach the courtyard and claim a corner to sit in while the adults unload. One girl stops to pick a sprig of rosemary from a bush along the wall, twirling it between her fingers as she walks. The smell drifts behind her, bright and sharp in the warm air. By the time you reach the bride's house, the courtyard is already half filled with chairs and benches from earlier in the morning. The new arrivals add their belongings to the growing collection bundles stacked, crates set gently down, a few fragile items carried inside to be stored on high shelves. The voices rise and blend until they are part of the same sound, the week beginning to gather itself into a shape that will not fully form until the first music starts. You step back toward the lane, leaving them to their greetings and unpacking. The ferry's bell rings faintly from the harbor below, and you picture it readying to carry someone else's news across the water. Here, though, the arrivals are done for the morning. The village feels a little fuller now, the air carrying new scents and voices that will linger until the last plate is cleared days from now. You pick up the broom as if it were an instrument you practiced long ago and only half forgot. It is taller than your shoulder and bristled with broomcorn, bound tight with twine that has gone soft from years of damp mornings. The lane lies in front of you, like a long, pale ribbon of dust, lightly folded where feet have passed since dawn. You test the sweep short strokes first, letting the bristles whisper to the stones, then settle into a patient rhythm that keeps time with your breathing. A neighbor emerges with her own broom and nods as if you have both joined a familiar procession. She begins at the far end, and the two of you work toward each other, dragging the dust into low, obedient ridges that look almost decorative before you push them aside. The air lifts in faint, glittering flecks and tries to climb back into your nostrils, but you tilt your head and give it the back of your hand. Someone brings a clay jug and splashes a thread of water across the stones. The dust darkens and calms. The bristles slide more quietly. A simple fact sets itself down beside your broom. In 19th century Greek villages, sweeping the lane before a feast or wedding is ordinary duty, a courtesy to neighbors and guests, and also a small announcement look. The house is awake. The household is ready. Whitewash will come later, perhaps, along the lower walls where knees and baskets brush. But first, dust must be convinced to live elsewhere. You choose a slow, looping path for your strokes, as if you were writing a letter on the ground to anyone who cares to read it. Calm, keep moving. Nothing to see here but tidiness. The stones are not smooth. They rise and settle in old familiar ways, remembering cartwheels and shoe soles, remembering even bare feet that press a different story into them every summer. Grain collects neatly at the edges and then tumbles over the side into a shallow gutter, the same one that drank the laundry water earlier. You hear the tiniest rattle as a seed skitters along the channel, a polite traveler in a hurry. A boy appears with a palm broom he has constructed from an ambitious bundle of twigs and a heroic length of string. He salutes you with it and sweeps one dramatic stripe, then another, carving a zigzag into the dust that serves no practical purpose. You thank him with the gravity he desires, which is the whole point of heroics at his age. He asks if the bride will notice his zigzag. You tell him that the lane will remember. This satisfies him briefly. He drifts away to compose a new invention from a plank, a stone, and good intentions. You work past a doorway where an old man has seated himself for the entertainment of watching others labor. He offers advice he has offered every year of his very long life. Sweep away from the door, never toward it. Sweep with the direction of the wind so the wind thinks you are on its side. Sweep until the stones show you their original color, which, he insists, is not gray, but dignified. He also says that in his mother's time, the women would toss a pinch of salt onto the threshold after sweeping to keep quarrels from slipping in with the new guests. You thank him for the memory and do not test the salt theory yet, though you tuck it away for the hour when certain cousins arrive with their appetites for conversation. Another neighbor appears with a small basket of rosemary clippings and crumbles a few sprigs underfoot as she sweeps. Each stroke bruises the leaves and sets a clean smell moving through the lane. as if the stones themselves have decided to be fragrant for the occasion. She says her aunt swears that scenting the sweep keeps flies less interested in the feast. You have never asked a fly for its opinion. It seems content to be a superstition that works whether or not it works. Meanwhile, the lane smells pleasant, which is victory enough. Across the way, a woman wipes her sill with a damp cloth, wringing it out between passes with the expert twist that turns wrists into ropes. Her cloth comes away light brown, then pale, then nearly clean. She leans to examine your section of stones with the narrowed eyes of someone prepared to find fault, and is sadly denied. She concedes that your broom has behaved itself. You give it a friendly stare, and it pretends indifference. Historians still argue whether pre-wedding sweeping carried a ritual edge, something to do with clearing ill luck or inviting good fortune, or whether it was simply the necessary vanity of hospitality. Some songs mention sweeping as threshold magic, a quiet spell to tidy the path for blessings. Others make no fuss of it at all, counting it among the chores that defend a household from the slow invasion of grit. You decide the argument is like dust. It settles where it pleases, and in time, gets swept again. You pause to stretch your back, feeling the pleasant ache that belongs to work at a reasonable pace. The bristles splay a little. You turn the broom one quarter and discover a firmer edge, the way you do when you rotate a loaf to find the best side for slicing. Someone calls for a pause and produces cups. The water is cool and has the faint limestone taste of the cistern, which is to say, it tastes exactly like a town that has decided to last. You drink and feel the dust rinse from your throat, then set the cup on a low step where it leaves a temporary circle. A small stray gust pushes a cone of dust down from the alley above, and you watch it approach like a polite guest arriving early. You and your neighbor meet it with measured strokes and guide it aside without ceremony. A dog wanders through your freshly convinced stones, tests a paw against the dampened patch, and decides to nap in the only unswept corner left. You share a look with the dog that says, "We each have our calling." The dog blinks and interprets this as agreement. There is a fringe practice your grandmother used to keep. She would sweep the lane in one continuous, unbroken path from the farthest corner toward the street mouth, never lifting the broom, as if breaking the line might let mischief double back. She did it with remarkable patience, and never explained it beyond, because that is how it is done. You try a small version of the practice now, drawing a single ribbon along one side, partly for memory, partly for the quiet satisfaction of finishing a line that never stutters. It pleases the part of you that enjoys even edges on bread and straight rows of chairs that no one will keep straight for long. As noon leans closer, the lane has changed color. The stones look washed, though no water has truly washed them, only the thin mercy of the jug from earlier. Your broom shows the day's work bristles slightly frayed, a pale film at the binding, yet still arrogant enough to think it could clean the whole island, if asked nicely. You stack the gathered dust with the other small pyramids near the gutter mouth, where later they will be scooped into a pan that always hides at the wrong end of the courtyard. The old man clears his throat and announces that your stretch of lane looks young again. You tell him that so does he. He pretends not to hear you, but lifts his chin in a way that suggests he has heard you quite clearly, and will allow the compliment to stand as long as no one repeats it. A donkey passes, careful with its hooves on the damp patch, and drags a shadow that cools the ground for the length of its body. You and your neighbor lean your brooms against the wall and admire the ordinary miracle. A path made ready for feet that will soon be too busy with music to watch where they land. There is still sweeping to do on the upper lane, and after that, perhaps the steps up to the church, and after that the quiet domestic corners no guest will see, but for now, this part is finished. You press your palm briefly to the stone. It holds a temperature that feels fair warm, but not hot, friendly, but not clingy. The scent of rosemary lingers. You breathe it in and think that surviving wedding week is, among other things, a matter of making the ground itself agreeable. When guests arrive, when they tip their heads back to laugh, when they lift their skirts or their cuffs to avoid spilling wine, the lane will be there beneath them, behaving well. It will not take credit. It will simply be clean. You stand before the shelf as if before a council of elders, each clay jug pretending it has no opinion, while quietly having several. The shelf itself is a board that knows your hands. You have lifted from it in winter and in summer, for water, for wine, for oil that moves more slowly than either. The lower edge bears shallow arcs, where the bellies of vessels have nudged the wood for years. Light comes in along the wall at an angle, laying a warm stripe across the necks. You touch them one by one, and feel how each keeps its own season cool from the clay's memory. A little powdery where the slip never shone, faintly slick where fingers have always gripped. This is the problem. The wedding week asks nicely for a jug, and not just any jug, but one you will not miss if it returns with a chip the size of an almond. You do the sensible thing, and begin with the worst jug, a small, thick one with a mouth like a stubborn purse. It is almost indestructible, and pours as though reluctant to part with whatever it holds. Its handle sits a little off-center, the potter having been interrupted at the wrong moment, perhaps 30 years ago, perhaps 40. You imagine guests scowling at the trickle and rule it out. You consider the opposite, the handsome jug that stands a little apart, as if it knows what regard is. It is fine-bellied, with a long neck and a handle that travels from lip to shoulder in a single confident curve. Its slip is the color of roasted chestnuts, and a thin green glaze winds around the rim, a flourish that keeps the mouth from roughening with use. You rub the glaze with your thumb and feel it smooth under your skin. This jug pours as if taught by a polite teacher who insisted on grace. It would show well among the trays and bowls that migrate from house to house in a week like this. It would also break your heart if someone set it too close to a stone edge. You set it back with a sigh and tell it that beauty can rest this time. A plain fact sits politely on your shoulder while you debate. In 19th century Greek households, clay jugs were everyday tools, porous earthenware that cooled water by slow breathing, glazed pieces for wine and oil, big-shouldered storage jars sleeping in the corner like docile animals. The porous ones make water taste like stone and shade. The glazed ones keep wine honest and oil patient. You have both, because most houses do, and because you learned long ago that each liquid prefers its own home. Your hand goes to a compromise jug, a medium weight, reliable mouth, a handle neither too high nor too low, its body stained here and there with rings where it once sat on damp boards. This jug has a habit of pouring cleanly even when hurried. You tilt it empty and watch the invisible stream leave the lip in your mind. You can practically hear it. It is not precious, but it is respectable. It is the sort of jug that volunteers for errands and returns dusty but cheerful. You keep one finger on it while you let your eye roam the shelf again. Beside it sits a wicker cradled bottle, the green glass showing between woven reeds where time has opened small windows. Your aunt insists the glass is better for wine on hot afternoons. Your neighbor swears it invites trouble because glass tells the sun too much of its secrets. Historians still argue whether such reed-wrapped bottles were widely adopted in island villages by the later 19th century, or whether clay ruled the table except on the wealthiest verandas. Old receipts mention both. Old photographs are unhelpfully posed. You find the argument charming and stop short of becoming a scholar on the subject by deciding you will lend what will not distress you when it returns smelling of lamb smoke. Your cousin once taught you a fringe habit. Scratch a small mark under the base. Hers is a crooked star, yours a tiny fish, so that when 20 jugs gather in a single courtyard, you can find your way back to your own without lifting each to your nose like a hound. You tip 2 vessels and see your shy fish there, darkened with age, almost gone. Another cousin swears that tucking a leaf of bay under the handle keeps envy from traveling with the jug. Another insists on myrtle. Another insists on nothing at all, and lives happily anyway. You pluck a bay leaf from the twig hanging to dry near the door, and set it aside, not because you are convinced, but because it takes no effort to humor the leaf. You lift the compromise jug from the shelf and test its balance. The handle fits your hand without argument. You pour a cup of water into it, then pour the water back into the basin, just to listen to the friendly, uninterrupted ribbon of sound. No gurgle, no sulk. You imagine the same steady stream coloring wine cups around dusk, the way that steady streams ease conversation. The jug passes its audition with the modesty of someone who knows the job and would like to get back to it. Still, you scan for a second jug, because wedding weeks multiply needs like summer multiplies flies. At the far end is an elderly fellow with a thick lip and a patch of old repair. A small lead touch staple, bridging a crack like a quiet confession. You remember the day your grandfather mended it, heating the staple and tapping it in with a measured tenderness you have never seen him lend to anything else. It has poured 1,000 times since and never complained, though you have learned to aim it directly and never toward a guest's sleeve. You decide to bring it as the backup, a veteran that knows how to behave when the first jug grows tired. You set both on the table and search for stoppers, the cork that stubbornly shrank last winter, the smoother one that likes the brown jug better. You test each with a twist and a press. Satisfied, you turn to the small matters that matter anyway. Wipe the rims with a damp cloth. Polish the handles with the heel of your palm. Breathe on the glaze once to see it wake. You tuck the bay leaf under the handle where it looks like an ornament invented by chance. You allow yourself the smallest half smile that says, "Very well, let's pretend we are cautious and blessed at once." A neighbor calls through the doorframe to ask if you have chosen. You lift the good enough jug and the veteran. He nods at the pair the way men nod at other men who will carry a load sensibly. He mentions in passing a custom his mother kept. Before lending, she would tap the jug's side 3 times with a knuckle so it would remember to return. He demonstrates with unnecessary seriousness, and the jug answers with a sound like a soft bell hidden inside clay. You give it your own 3 taps because the sound pleases you. There is one more handsome piece on the top shelf, a painted jug with a band of little eyes, blue and black, staring outward around the shoulder. It was made in a town across water. The eyes were meant to watch away mischief. You like it and do not trust it among elbows. You leave it to its watchers and close the idea of it with a gentle shake of your head. Beauty can survive another day by staying home. You carry the chosen pair into the light. The lane receives them without comment, which is the best reception for objects that must work. You test each again with a little water, then set them by the door to wait for the boy who will be sent to borrow for just the evening, which will mean 2 days, perhaps 3. You do not mind. This is how the week knits neighbors into one large temporary household, with chairs, with songs, with jugs that tour the village and come back smelling of whatever stories they poured. As you wipe your hands on your apron, you notice a thin shadow along the veteran's repair and press it gently. It holds. The jug is sound enough, if treated as something to be respected rather than tested. You decide to mention this to whoever takes it, and then you decide not to. Sometimes warnings invite the very clumsiness they fear. Let the jug rely on its own dignity. Historians still argue whether households brought out their finest vessels during wedding week to show the wealth of care, or hid those same pieces in cupboards so that generosity could not be measured and envied. Stories lean both ways, depending on the teller's temperament. You take the tidy middle road. Lend what is sturdy and pleasant. Keep the one that would sting if lost. Trust the weak to return what it borrows, altered only by a new ring on the wood where it rested, or a faint memory of time on its shoulder. You set the jugs in the patch of shade by the threshold, and listen to the faint sea sound moving up the lane. In a little while, you will hear music being tuned, chairs being dragged into new equations, voices pulling the afternoon toward evening. For the moment, it is quiet. You run a finger along the good enough jug's lip one last time, like touching a friend's sleeve before they go, and then you let them wait for their errand. By the time you reach the courtyard, the air already carries the faint scrape of wood on stone. Men are moving like slow machinery pairs and trios, bent over their work, lifting and setting, adjusting and pausing to assess. 2 long planks are balanced on uneven trestles, the kind that look as if they might collapse in protest, yet have endured decades of feasts and quarrels without folding. Someone mutters that the boards are warped, as if this were news. Another replies that all boards are warped, just as all guests are impatient, and the sooner you accept it, the easier the week will be. You step into the shade, where more planks lean against the wall, their ends marked with the old notches that have matched them to particular trestles since before you were born. Each plank has its own memory of wine stains, knife scores, and circles left by cups set down too heavily. A boy slides one along the ground toward a pair of waiting hands. The wood hums softly over the stone, and a faint powder lifts from it. A plain fact: in 19th century Greek village weddings, the long tables were rarely permanent fixtures. They were assembled from whatever could be borrowed or built for the occasion, their surfaces joined in uneven marriages of old timber and newer boards. On them would sit the sum of the community's capacity for food, wine, and the arrangement of people in ways that kept harmony, or at least the appearance of it. One man kneels at the far end, folding a strip of cloth into a pad to steady a wobbly trestle. He presses his thumb against it and nods when the plank above lies flatter. Another man brings a small hammer and taps in a nail that will later be removed and tucked into a pocket, as if it were a personal talisman rather than a bent piece of iron. You hear someone counting seats aloud, their voice climbing when they realize the number has shifted since yesterday's plan. From the kitchen comes a call to keep the central lane clear so platters can pass without mishap. The men adjust their work like chess players, sliding boards a little left, a little right, until an invisible line is agreed upon. No one marks it. Everyone will remember it until they forget, which will be halfway through the feast when the tables are shifted again to make room for more dancers. A man you have known all your life stands back to admire his handiwork. He has contributed 2 trestles, one taller than the other, so that the plank between them sags in the middle like a hammock. He insists the dip is intentional, better for keeping dishes from sliding. No one argues, partly out of courtesy, partly because the trestles are already in place, and moving them now would invite a fresh chain of adjustments. Historians still argue whether the unevenness of such tables was considered a flaw to be hidden or simply accepted as part of the feast's charm. Some accounts describe meticulous leveling with wedges and shims. Others suggest that once the tablecloth was thrown, the surface might be as lumpy as a hillside, and no one minded as long as the food was steady. You suspect both are true, depending on the temperament of the host and the stubbornness of the carpenter. A fringe custom is mentioned, placing a sprig of basil under each trestle to bring sweetness to the gathering. One man says his aunt swore by it. Another says his aunt swore at it, having once found a trail of ants investigating the basil. In the end, someone tucks one sprig under the central table as a token gesture, the way people sometimes greet only the eldest guest first, and let that stand for the rest. The sun shifts, striping the courtyard floor with lines of shadow from the roof beams above. A jug of water appears, and the men pass it hand to hand, drinking without wiping the rim because here, during wedding week, a little shared dust or salt is part of the contract. You take a swallow and feel it settle coolly in your chest, the faint limestone edge reminding you that the cistern has been drawn on heavily today. The tables are left bare for now, their raw boards exposed to the air. Later, they will be covered with cloths, smoothed by careful hands, then weighted with the slow arrival of dishes. Now, though, they are just the bones of the feast, waiting in their mismatched geometry for the week to fill them in. A small boy climbs onto one plank and is immediately told to get down before his feet make a memory in the wood that will wobble under some unlucky guest. He hops off, grinning, and dashes toward the sound of a fiddle being tuned somewhere out of sight. The boards settle back into their patient stillness, holding the shape of the celebration to come. You step back into the lane, letting the sound of hammering fade behind you. The air smells faintly of sawdust and rosemary from the nearby walls. Somewhere ahead, you can hear the irregular rhythm of feet trying to keep time to music that has not yet decided on a tempo. You follow it, knowing the day will keep moving whether the tables are ready or not. The sound reaches you before the sight. A jumble of feet striking packed earth, too many rhythms layered together, punctuated by bursts of laughter when someone missteps. You turn into the small open square where a group of children are trying to remember the wedding dance. They have no music, only the humming of an older boy who is certain he knows the tune, though he changes it every few breaths. Dust lifts in soft spirals under their sandals, catching the sunlight in a way that makes the whole space seem to glow. You lean against a wall, smoothed by years of leaning, and watch as 2 girls attempt the first turn. One steps too soon, the other too late, and they collide shoulder to shoulder before dissolving into grins. An uncle, seated on an upturned crate at the edge of the square, claps the rhythm slowly, like a heartbeat slowed by afternoon heat. He has been instructing the children for most of the morning, which seems to involve more storytelling than actual teaching. A plain fact, in 19th century Greece, the kalamatianos and sirtos were staples of wedding celebrations, often danced in long open circles that wound through courtyards and streets. Children learned the steps almost by osmosis, watching from the edges of adult dances until their feet could mimic the patterns without thinking. Practice during wedding week was as much about excitement as skill. Perfection was never the point, only participation. The older boy who hums the tune tries a more ambitious pace, and half the dancers drop out, choosing instead to clap along or chase each other in loops around the square. One small girl with hair tied back by a strip of faded blue cloth keeps dancing alone, her bare feet light and quick, toes finding the beat even when the humming wanders. She pauses only to shoo a chicken that strays into her path, then steps back into the rhythm as if nothing happened. You are handed a cup of cool water by a woman who has been watching from a doorway. She tells you that in her own childhood, the week before a wedding meant daily gatherings like this, where children wore through their sandals in the dust and went home with the music still in their heads. Sometimes, she says, the best dancers among them were invited to join the adults' circle during the feast, an honor that was remembered for years afterward. A fringe bit of lore comes to mind. Some families believed it was unlucky to let a child lead the dance before the wedding day itself, fearing it would invite the evil eye to take notice of the event too soon. Others ignored this entirely, insisting that a lively rehearsal brought joy into the house before the guests arrived. Historians still argue whether these cautions were widespread beliefs or simply local quirks that survived in certain pockets of the islands. The uncle claps louder now, calling for the children to form a proper line. They link hands, some with a little hesitation, and begin the simple forward and back step. Their bodies sway in uneven unison, the chain bending and straightening like a length of seaweed in shallow water. When the boy's humming falters, a girl in the middle picks it up, her voice clear and high, carrying the melody forward without missing a step. A breeze slips through the square, stirring the dust and lifting the edges of skirts. It cools the sweat at the back of your neck and brings with it the faint smell of roasting meat from somewhere else in the village. The children notice it too. Several lift their heads, sniffing the air like dogs catching a familiar scent before returning to their pattern. One boy, too young to keep the pace, abandons the line and crouches near a wall to draw shapes in the dirt with a stick. Another trips and pulls his neighbor down with him, creating a small tangle of limbs that untangles with giggles and no harm done. The uncle shakes his head as if to say, this is all part of the process, which it is. The dust settles slowly after they finish clapping for themselves. Their faces are flushed, their hair sticking to their temples, their eyes bright with the mixture of pride and relief that comes from any rehearsal, however imperfect. They scatter toward the shade, leaving behind the quiet print of their feet in the earth. The uncle remains on his crate, drumming his hands on his knees in a slow rhythm, as if keeping the dance alive until the music can take it again. You finish your water and set the cup on the wall, letting your hand rest there a moment. The stone is warm, holding the day's breath, and the sound of the dance still lingers faintly in your ears. You step away from the square, thinking how wedding week seems to teach the young ones that survival is not only in the work, but in the pauses, the playful steps that remind everyone what the work is for. You follow the sound of low voices into the cool shadow of a side street where the bride's family has laid out her dowry for all to see. The courtyard gate stands open, inviting anyone to wander in and admire. The display is neat but not stiff, each object set so it catches the light, each cloth folded to show its best edge. You step inside and feel the sudden change in temperature stone walls, holding the night's coolness, the air faintly scented with cedar from the chests. A plain fact: in 19th century Greece, it was customary for a bride's dowry to be displayed before the wedding, partly as proof of her preparedness for marriage, and partly as a matter of family pride. Linens, clothing, kitchenware, and sometimes coins or jewelry were set out so that neighbors and visiting relatives could admire the quality and quantity. It was both a social event and a silent inventory. Along one wall, a low table is covered with folded sheets, each stack crowned with a sprig of rosemary or lavender. The linen is thick and cool to the touch, its whiteness a sign of many careful washings. Some pieces have borders of colored thread, the patterns precise but softened by age. An older woman gestures toward one with a design of red diamonds and says it was embroidered by the bride's grandmother when she was only 14. Beside the linen stand brass and copper cooking pots, polished until they hold a dim reflection of the courtyard's light. The larger ones still smell faintly of olive oil. The smaller ones are clean and dry, waiting for whatever stews and sauces will come in the new household. You run your fingers along the rim of one and feel the slight ripple left by the hammer that shaped it. At the far end, propped on a low stand, is a chest with carved panels, birds, and vines, twisting into each other in a way that suggests both patience and a steady hand. Its lid is open to show carefully folded garments, wool skirts in deep colors, cotton blouses with narrow lace at the cuffs, scarves in patterns that will brighten winter days. A pair of leather shoes rests on top, the soles thick and still carrying the faint smell of the tannery. A fringe item catches your attention, a small clay jar painted with blue swirls, said to have been made by the bride's uncle when he was apprenticed in a town across the water. It is not strictly useful, but it has been placed prominently, the family agreeing that sentiment can take its place among necessities during a week like this. One visitor leans close to inspect it and says that in her village, such jars were once filled with honey and given to the bride to sweeten the first days of marriage. Another shakes her head and says that was only ever a coastal habit, never seen inland. Historians still argue over the origin of such customs, whether they were rooted in ancient ritual or simply in the human fondness for giving symbolic gifts. Children drift in and out, drawn by the shiny surfaces and the faintly forbidden air of touching what is not yet theirs. A small boy runs a finger along the smooth wood of the chest and is quickly reminded to keep his hands behind his back. An older girl stands over the copper pots as if guarding them, though she is mostly just enjoying the excuse to stand in the shade. Visitors murmur to each other in the low, appreciative tones reserved for such occasions. Some comment on the even weave of the linens. Others admire the deep polish of the brass. A man you recognize as the groom's uncle studies a wool blanket, then nods in a way that says it will serve its purpose well in a mountain winter. You step closer to a corner where smaller items are gathered. Carved wooden spoons, a narrow rolling pin worn smooth from years of use, a set of clay cups with faint traces of glaze along the rims. Each piece feels as though it has been chosen not just for usefulness, but for the story it carries. This spoon carved by a grandfather, that rolling pin passed from mother to daughter, those cups once part of a larger set broken by accident long ago. The courtyard hums with a kind of quiet pride. No one speaks too loudly. Admiration is shown more by the time people spend lingering over each item than by words. The display will remain here for days, and each visit will add to its history. A neighbor will remember a detail. An aunt will recall who first owned a certain pot. A child will imagine herself standing in the bride's place one day. As you step back toward the gate, the sun catches on the brass pots, sending a brief flare of light across the wall. The air outside feels warmer after the cool of the courtyard, and you blink against it, carrying the image of neat stacks and polished metal in your mind. Wedding week, you think, is as much about showing the readiness of a household as it is about the feast itself. And readiness, here, is measured in linen, copper, and the stories that cling to them. The smell reaches you halfway down the lane, a warm, nutty steam that makes the air feel thicker. You follow it into a side courtyard, where a great copper cauldron squats over a low fire, its belly polished only where hands have touched it in stirring. The wheat inside is already swollen and soft, bobbing lazily in the cloudy water, the surface broken every so often by a gentle stir from the long-handled wooden spoon. The air is damp here, and the walls shine faintly where the steam has curled up to kiss the lime wash. A plain fact: in many 19th century Greek villages, boiled wheat was prepared during wedding week as part of the offerings for guests, a simple, sustaining dish often sweetened with honey or dressed with nuts and spices. It could feed many without fuss and keep well enough to serve again the next day, making it as practical as it was traditional. A woman stands at the cauldron, her sleeves rolled high, her face marked with a shine of effort. She stirs slowly, lifting the spoon from the depths so the grains roll back into the broth like tiny pebbles slipping into a tide pool. Another woman crouches nearby, tending the fire with careful pinches of kindling so the boil stays steady but not fierce. You can hear the muted clink as the spoon taps the rim on each turn. The courtyard smells of wheat, wood smoke, and faintly of cinnamon from the small bowl set aside for later. A low table nearby holds more ingredients. Chopped walnuts in a shallow wooden tray, golden raisins plumped in water, and a jar of thick honey whose surface catches the light. Someone will stir these in toward the end, folding sweetness into the grain so it surprises the tongue between the softer flavors. You are handed the spoon for a while, and the weight of it surprises you. It pulls on your wrist in slow circles, the motion settling into your shoulders. The wheat moves heavily, like a thickened sea, and each pass leaves a pale wake that closes again almost immediately. Steam rises against your face and dampens your hairline. The warmth is steady and all, absorbing, leaving you aware only of the smell and the slow pull of the spoon. One of the women tells you, in a voice that suggests she believes it entirely, that stirring in one direction keeps the dish from turning out confused. "I," she says, her own grandmother, would swat anyone who dared to reverse the motion midway. Another woman laughs and says direction makes no difference, only patience matters, but admits she still stirs the way her mother did, without thinking. Historians still argue whether such small rules had roots in ritual or were simply the habits of cooks who preferred their kitchens orderly. A boy arrives carrying a small jug of fresh water from the well. The woman at the fire tips a little into the pot to keep the wheat from tightening too soon. The sound is a quiet hiss, quickly swallowed. She nods at you to keep the spoon moving, as if stopping for even a breath would undo all the hours of gentle heat. The courtyard fills with more voices as neighbors drift in to check the progress. Some carry baskets of almonds still in their shells. Others bring extra jars of honey or packets of spice wrapped in cloth. A small pile of discarded cinnamon sticks grows in the corner where children have been pretending they are pipes or wand. When the wheat has softened enough, the fire is banked low, and the spoon rests across the pot's mouth. The women taste from the edge, blowing across each small wooden spoonful before nodding in agreement. The sweetness will come later. For now, it is enough that the grains are tender and the broth thick without being heavy. You step back and watch as the cauldron is shifted slightly from the fire, resting now over a bed of slow coals. A cloth is draped loosely over the top to keep out dust while allowing the steam to drift free. In the quiet that follows, the smell of wheat lingers in the air, mixing with the smoke from the fire and the faint perfume of drying herbs that hang from the eaves. Someone presses a small cup into your hand to taste, still plain, but rich with the flavor of the grain itself. It is soft and warm against your tongue, the kind of food that feels older than memory, as if it has been eaten in exactly this way for centuries. You finish it slowly, knowing more will come later, sweetened and adorned. When the tables are full and the music louder, leaving the courtyard, you notice the steam curling into the lane, carrying the promise of something humble but generous. You think about how wedding week is built not only on the grand gestures, but on the steady simmering of pots like this one, meals that begin in the quiet of the morning and end in the full company of the night. You step back into the lane and nearly walk into a knot of neighbors locked in the kind of discussion that sounds polite but has teeth. The subject, it turns out, is chairs again, or rather, how many are needed now that someone's sister's husband's cousin has decided to attend, and possibly bring two more from the mainland. The air between them is warm with numbers, 35, 37, 40, each one adjusted with a tilt of the head and a squint as though peering at an invisible seating chart in the dust. A plain fact, in many 19th century Greek villages, weddings were not small affairs. The guest list often changed by the hour as travelers arrived unannounced. Fishermen returned with friends in tow, and distant relatives decided that this was the year to renew family ties. The host families prepared as generously as they could, knowing that no matter how carefully they counted, the final tally would defy them. Someone suggests borrowing more benches from the next village. Another shakes his head, muttering about the uneven legs on those benches. A third voice says, "There's no point, people can stand if they must." This earns a slow, deliberate look from an older woman, who reminds him that standing guests drink more wine to keep themselves occupied, which in turn means more refilling, which in turn means running out of wine too soon. The logic is circular but persuasive. A fringe memory surfaces from the group. An old wedding when extra guests arrived in such numbers that the courtyard wall became a seating area. Men sat along its length, swinging their legs and balancing plates on their knees, while the women pretended not to notice the dust that drifted from the wall's crumbling plaster into the food. Some claim this improvised seating added charm. Others recall it as proof that proper planning had failed. Historians still argue whether such overspills were marks of a village's generosity or its lack of preparation. The talk shifts to who will sit where, which is a more delicate matter than the numbers themselves. It is generally agreed that placing certain uncles too close together invites old quarrels to wake. Likewise, separating particular cousins risks a sulk that could last the entire evening. The solution, it seems, is to scatter potential troublemakers at the edges of different tables, ideally with buffers of cheerful neighbors between them. A woman declares that seating arrangements are like braiding hair. If you cross the wrong strands too early, you will never get the pattern right. The group drifts toward the courtyard to measure the space again, as though it might have grown overnight. You follow, watching them count out loud while pacing the length of the table rows, marking places with small chips of tile. One man squints at the tiles and says they seem too close together. Another says they are fine, unless the guests are too broad in the shoulder. This sparks a brief argument about the relative width of different families, which is settled only when someone points out that the sun is climbing and the tiles will be too hot to touch if they keep debating. In the corner, a boy tries to help by setting out stools in a neat line, but his line curves like a riverbank. No one corrects him. There is something charming about his small procession of mismatched seats, and they will be moved later anyway. A girl offers to fetch more cushions from her grandmother's house, insisting that the faded embroidery on them makes people less likely to notice if the stool itself wobbles. As the counting winds down, it is decided, though no one says it aloud, that there will always be room for one more guest, even if it means someone perches on the edge of a step or shares a bench with 3 others. This, after all, is the unspoken rule of wedding week. The tables stretch as far as they must, and the meal is seasoned with whatever compromises are needed to keep everyone fed and talking. The group disperses slowly, still murmuring numbers, as though rehearsing them might keep the guest list from growing in the hours ahead. You step aside to let them pass, the sunlight glancing off their hair and shoulders, and you think that no matter how many times they count, the real number will only reveal itself once the plates are set and the first song begins. You find yourself drawn toward a quieter corner of the courtyard, where a long table has been cleared, except for a shallow wooden tray and several small bundles wrapped in linen. The bundles are untied one by one, revealing beeswax tapers in uneven shades of gold, their surfaces bearing the faint ripples left by the cooling molds. The smell is soft and warm honey without the sweetness, a memory of summer flowers pressed into solid form. A plain fact, in 19th century Greek villages, candles played a steady role in wedding celebrations, not just for the evening light, but for their presence in certain ceremonies. They were counted, set aside, and sometimes decorated with ribbons or sprigs of greenery before being brought to the church. The counting was not casual. Each taper had its place and its purpose. 2 women sit at the table, sliding the candles gently from one hand to the other as they sort them by length. A small pile of the shorter ones is set aside for the children to carry. The longer ones will stand in the corners of the courtyard and at the entrance to the church. Each time the count reaches a certain number, someone repeats it aloud, as if speaking the total makes it safer from being forgotten. You take a seat nearby and are handed a soft cloth to polish each taper's surface. The beeswax warms under your fingers, and you can feel the faint give of it, as though it still remembers being liquid. Tiny flecks of dust cling to the cloth, and you brush them away before setting each candle into its own neat row. One of the women tells you a fringe custom her grandmother swore by. Always make the final count of candles in silence, so that no jealous spirit can hear the number and decide to interfere. She says her grandmother once broke her own rule, and a sudden wind blew through the courtyard, snapping a candle in half before it could be used. Another woman rolls her eyes, saying that wind is wind and candles are candles, but admits she too sometimes counts without speaking. Historians still argue whether such silences were remnants of older protective rituals or simply good luck charms kept alive by habit. The pile of polished tapers grows, their smooth sides catching the angled sunlight from the open doorway. A few have small imperfections, slight bends or bubbles trapped inside, but these are set aside with no shame, destined for places where their flaws will be hidden by shadow. The best of the lot are perfectly straight, their cut ends clean and pale against the deeper gold of their sides. You help arrange them in bundles of 5, wrapping each bundle loosely in linen and tying it with twine. The twine smells faintly of hay and rain, its fibers rough against the soft finish of the wax. The bundles are stacked carefully into a wicker basket lined with fresh rosemary sprigs, which will scent them faintly when they are unwrapped again. When the final bundle is placed, the counting begins one last time. The women fall silent halfway through, smiling faintly at each other as they continue the tally without speaking. You join in the quiet, moving your lips without sound, feeling the numbers fall into place in your head. The last candle is touched lightly, as if sealing the count in place. A boy appears at the doorway, peering in to ask whether he can take one candle now for practice. He is told no, gently but firmly, and sent off with a smaller stub left over from last winter's stock. He holds it like a treasure anyway, and runs off into the sun. You watch as the basket is lifted and carried toward the shaded room where the other wedding supplies are kept, linen folded on one shelf, copper polished and stacked on another, baskets of almonds and figs tucked into the coolest corner. The candles will rest there until the night they are needed, their soft scent waiting quietly in the dark. As you step back into the lane, the smell of beeswax clings faintly to your hands. It mixes with the sharper sense of time and dust, and you think about how many small, careful tasks like this one are hidden inside the bustle of wedding week. When the courtyard glows on the night of the feast, no one will notice the exact number of candles, or the way they were polished, or the silence that kept their count safe. But the light will be there all the same, steady and golden, making the night seem warmer than it is. The afternoon is slipping toward gold when a stir of voices announces the arrival of the groom's friends. They come down the lane in a loose cluster, walking at a pace that suggests they stopped more than once along the way, perhaps at a neighbor's courtyard for a cup of wine, perhaps simply to talk too long under a patch of shade. Their shirts are open at the neck, sleeves rolled in mismatched ways, and a few carry bundles slung casually over their shoulders. One man waves a sprig of basil like a banner. Another has a tambourine tucked under his arm, its jingles muted by his palm. A plain fact: in many 19th century Greek villages, the groom's friends, often cousins, neighbors, and childhood companions, would arrive in a body before the wedding, lending their labor and their noise to the preparations. They were there to help set up, to escort the groom to certain rituals, and not least, to make sure the air around the wedding never grew too quiet. They are greeted with that special mix of welcome and mock scolding, reserved for those who are late but still expected. A woman calls from a doorway, asking if they've brought what they promised. One man lifts a cloth-covered basket in response, but does not yet reveal its contents. Another neighbor shouts that they'd better be ready to work as hard as they've walked, which earns him a laugh and a half-serious salute. The friends drop their bundles by the wall and settle onto low stools, accepting cups of water before anyone asks them to lift a finger. Their conversation flows easily, moving from teasing about who will dance longest to good-natured arguments about which fiddler should lead the music. One of them produces a small bag of almonds from his pocket, cracking the shells with his teeth and sharing the kernels around. A fringe story surfaces in the talk. One man claims his uncle once arrived so late to a wedding week that the tables were already full. To avoid embarrassment, the uncle stood outside the gate and played the lute until someone came to fetch him, declaring that music was his contribution. Another friend insists this is nonsense, that the same uncle arrived early and ate so much during preparations that people still tease him about it. Historians, of course, cannot settle such debates. They live in the space between pride and exaggeration. After the water is gone and the almonds reduced to shells, the friends finally stand. They are assigned tasks, with the formality of a game too, to help move the last of the chairs. One to carry a message to the baker, another to fetch a borrowed knife from a house down the hill. The man with the tambourine is told pointedly that he can either play or work, but not both at once. He chooses work for now, promising music later when the tables are dressed. The lane briefly becomes a place of motion again, chairs scraping over stone, footsteps echoing under the low eaves, voices calling back and forth as errands begin. You see one friend pause to smell the sprig of basil he has been carrying, then tuck it into the pocket of his shirt as if keeping it for luck. As the light softens, they return in twos and threes, some with dust on their trousers, others carrying small treasures for the feast. One man brings a loaf from the baker, its crust still warm. Another arrives with a jug of wine balanced carefully in both hands. The tambourine appears again, and its jingles thread through the courtyard as the men lean against the wall, trading stories that grow taller with each telling. There is a sense that their real work is not in the lifting or carrying, but in filling the air with the kind of sound that makes labor lighter. Even the older neighbors seem to work more steadily when the friends are near, as though the noise is a kind of fuel. And perhaps it is the laughter, the clinking of cups, the teasing that carries just far enough to be heard, but not so far as to offend. When they finally disperse for the evening meal, the courtyard feels a little quieter, though not empty. They will return tomorrow, and the day after, and perhaps again after the wedding itself, to help take down what they have helped put up. For now, their absence leaves only the echo of footsteps and the faint scent of basil lingering in the lane. You step back into the shade, thinking that surviving wedding week often depends as much on the arrival of noise as on the completion of tasks. The groom's friends may not bring perfect punctuality, but they bring a different kind of readiness, one measured in laughter, and the comfortable way work gets done when people are glad to do it together. The sun has dipped just enough for the shadows to stretch longer across the lanes when a neighbor appears at your doorway, slightly out of breath, asking if you have a ladle to lend. Not just any ladle, she specifies a large one, big enough to reach the bottom of the wide copper pot they will be using for the wedding stew. You picture the various ones in your kitchen and know immediately which she means. The deep-bowled, long-handled wooden ladle that has been hanging from the same nail for as long as you can remember. A plain fact: in 19th century Greek village kitchens, certain tools had a reputation that spread beyond the household. A well-made ladle, sturdy and balanced, was as likely to travel around the neighborhood as a chair or jug during wedding week, borrowed for whatever cooking demanded both volume and grace. You take it down from its nail, feeling the slight smoothness where your hand has polished the wood over years of use. The bowl is darkened from countless stews, and the handle has a faint curve from being carved to fit the palm. It is not new, but it has a way of scooping without spilling a small miracle when dealing with pots that could feed half the village. Still, you hesitate for a moment. Lending the ladle means not seeing it for several days, and you remember other times it returned faintly singed or with a new scrape across its grain. Your grandmother once told you that a cooking week without the right ladle was like a song without its refrain possible, but lacking something essential. She also believed, in a fringe bit of kitchen lore, that the ladle should always leave the house clean and dry so that it would come back full and cheerful. You wash it quickly, drying it with the corner of your apron until the wood shines softly. When you hand it over, the neighbor cradles it with more care than you expected, promising to keep it safe. She even tests its balance in the air, smiling at the way it turns smoothly in her grip. Historians still argue whether such borrowings were purely practical exchanges or quiet measures of trust between households. Some suggest that lending good tools was a subtle way of showing confidence in a neighbor's care. Others think it was simply unavoidable when the scale of cooking exceeded what one kitchen could supply. You follow her down the lane, curious to see the pot it will serve. In the courtyard, the copper pot gleams in the fading light, its sides broad enough to reflect whole fragments of the sky. It rests on a tripod above a small pile of wood that has yet to be lit. The smell of chopped onions drifts from a table nearby, along with baskets of tomatoes, green beans, and long strips of lamb waiting their turn. The ladle is set beside the pot like a trusted companion. Someone makes a small joke about how, in this village, the ladle is nearly as famous as the weddings it attends. You laugh, but you also notice the way people treat it. No one sets anything heavy on it. No one lets it drop to the ground. It has a kind of temporary authority, like an elder who has agreed to supervise the meal. As preparations continue, the ladle is tested in the pot. Its reach is perfect, the bowl dipping deep enough to bring up a generous measure without splashing. One of the younger helpers tries it and nods as if he has been entrusted with a weapon of some importance. The neighbor thanks you again, this time with the solemnity that certain tools seem to command. When you turn to leave, you take one last glance at it resting against the rim of the copper. By the end of the week, it will have stirred meat and vegetables, lifted broth into bowls, and perhaps been passed from hand to hand in the press of the feast. It will come back with new stains and the scent of smoke caught in its grain, and you will wash it again before hanging it back on its nail. Walking home, you think about how wedding week moves not only on laughter and music, but also on the quiet migration of tools, each one carrying the marks of its work. A ladle, a jug, a stool. They travel the village, doing their part, and then return with the week's story written into their surfaces. And though no one says it aloud, the safe return of each piece is one more way the village measures whether the wedding was truly a success. In the slanted shade of a fig tree, the women have gathered with baskets at their feet, each one brimming with almonds still in their pale, knobbled shells. The air is warm but softened by the leaves above, which shift just enough to let flecks of sunlight fall across their laps. You hear the first sharp crack. Before you see it, a stone tapping against a heavier stone, followed by the soft tumble of freed almonds into a waiting bowl. A plain fact: in 19th century Greek villages, almonds were a common feature in wedding week preparations, cracked and peeled to be folded into sweets, scattered over boiled wheat, or offered on their own as part of the feast. Their work was slow but steady, the kind of task that kept hands busy while conversation filled the space. You sit beside one of the baskets, and a woman passes you a smooth river stone to use as your striker. It fits comfortably into your palm, cool at first but warming quickly as you work. The shells give with a small snap, and the nut slips out with a faint, dusty smell. Some are pale ivory, others touched with a light gold from drying in the sun. The rhythm of cracking and shelling is almost like a drumbeat, irregular but familiar. Someone hums a tune without committing to it fully, letting the notes drift away whenever the conversation picks up. The talk moves easily from recipes to family stories to speculation about how many guests will try to take almonds home in their pockets. A fringe bit of lore surfaces. One woman swears that if you crack an almond perfectly in half without breaking the nut inside, it means you'll hear unexpected good news before the week is out. Another says that is nonsense, but she still pauses to examine each shell before tossing it aside. Historians still argue whether such small superstitions were shared across the islands or merely invented in certain courtyards to make long work feel shorter. The bowls slowly fill with the smooth, blanched shapes, while the growing pile of empty shells sends up a faint, woody scent. A chicken wanders near, pecking curiously at the shells before being shooed away. Children hover at the edge of the group, hoping to snatch an almond or two, but are told to wait until the sweets are ready. The talk shifts to memories of other weddings, whose almonds were roasted, whose were left raw, who mixed them with sesame or coated them in honey. One woman claims that her grandmother once boiled the nuts in rose water before adding sugar, a method that made the air in the kitchen smell like a garden at dusk. Several women murmur approval, but none commit to trying it this year. There is comfort in the way certain flavors return exactly as they always have. When your fingers grow tired, you pause to rub them against your apron, feeling the faint oil from the nuts on your skin. It smells faintly sweet and earthy, a reminder that the almonds were still on the branch not long ago. A breeze moves through the courtyard, scattering a few empty shells across the ground like small, pale boats. By the time the last basket is emptied, the bowls are heaped high, and the sun has shifted so that the shade is thinner under the fig tree. The almonds will be divided, some for sweets, some for the boiled wheat, a few to be set aside for guests who will ask after them, long after the feast. As you stand, the faint crack and drop rhythm still lingers in your ears, a sound that will repeat itself in other courtyards this week, each one working toward the same evening. You brush a few shell fragments from your lap and carry a bowl inside, the weight of it solid in your hands, smelling faintly of both patience and celebration. From somewhere near the edge of the village, you hear the wavering sound of strings being coaxed into order. It's not music yet, more a wandering conversation between notes, some too sharp, others slumping just shy of where they should rest. You follow the sound to a shaded terrace where the musicians have gathered, each with an instrument across their lap or propped against a knee. A plain fact: in 19th century Greek wedding weeks, the musicians were as essential to the atmosphere as the food or the flowers. They might be from the same village, or from a neighboring one, but once they arrived, their presence was felt in every courtyard and lane. The tuning began long before the first formal song, drifting into daily life like the scent of baking bread. One man plucks the strings of his lauto, pausing to adjust a peg with slow precision. The metal frets catch the light, worn smooth where fingers have walked them over years. Another musician leans over his violin, bow in hand but idle, twisting the tuning pegs in small, deliberate turns. A third sits cross-legged on a low wall, blowing gently into a wooden flute, the sound thin and testing. They take turns playing short phrases, listening to how each instrument settles into the air. Sometimes they stop to talk about the set they will play for the bride's procession, about which songs will please the oldest guests, about the order that will keep the dancers from tiring too quickly. You sense this talk has been repeated for every wedding they have played, with only the names and small details changing. A fringe superstition surfaces in the conversation. One fiddler insists that tuning in complete silence is bad luck, that the instruments need to hear voices while they are finding their pitch. Another says the only bad luck comes from a string breaking on the morning of the wedding. Historians still argue whether such beliefs were widely held or simply the personal habits of musicians who like the idea of invisible rules guiding their craft. The lauto player strums a chord that hangs in the air, fuller now, more confident. The violin answers with a smooth rising note, then another that bends slightly as the peg is nudged. The flute slips into the space between them, weaving a soft thread of melody. It's still not a song, but it is closer, like a doorway half open, letting you glimpse the room beyond. Someone produces a small clay jug of wine and pours into chipped cups, setting them on the wall beside the instruments. They drink between adjustments, the wine loosening the shoulders, making the music settle faster. A boy from the lane appears with a small drum and asks if he can join. They tell him to come back tomorrow, but let him tap the skin once, just to feel the sound under his palm. As the tuning draws toward harmony, the mood shifts. The lauto begins a steady rhythm, quiet but insistent, and the violin folds in a low melody. The flute hovers above them, light and wandering, until the three find each other and fall into a pattern that might, in another minute, become a dance. But they stop before it gets that far, letting the air keep the unfinished promise. You stay a while longer, leaning in the doorway, listening to the stray notes drift into the lane. Somewhere nearby, a woman pauses in hanging laundry to hum along with a fragment she recognizes. The musicians smile at each other, half for the music, half for the way it has already begun to spill into the village without them trying. When you finally turn away, the sound follows you, not as a full song, but as a steady awareness that the week is gathering its players. Soon these instruments will fill the night until no one remembers when they last heard silence. For now, they are just finding their place, like everyone else. You find the well by following the sound of water sloshing in a wooden bucket, each step sending a faint echo down into the cool stone throat. The air here is different, cooler, sharper, touched with the smell of wet rope and moss. A line has formed, as it often does in the days before a wedding, each person waiting with their own vessel in hand. Clay jars with narrow necks, copper pots that gleam faintly in the filtered light, and a few battered tin pails, whose dents tell a longer story than their owners care to. A plain fact: in 19th century Greek villages, fresh water for the wedding feast had to be carried from the well or spring, often in repeated trips over the course of the day. Even households close to the source would make special effort to draw the clearest, coldest water, knowing that guests would drink more freely in the press of the celebrations. You wait your turn, listening to the rope squeak softly against the wooden pulley as the bucket rises. When it reaches the surface, the water inside trembles in the sunlight clear enough to show the pattern of the wood grain in the bucket's base. The woman ahead of you tips it carefully into a broad copper basin, the stream breaking into silver threads before it gathers again. Your own vessel is a medium clay jar with a rounded belly and a lip worn smooth by years of pouring. You lean it gently against your leg while the bucket sinks again, the rope unwinding in a steady hum. The sound of the splash when it meets the water below is oddly satisfying, a muted, distant clap. An older man tells you as you wait that his mother always drew the first bucket of the day in silence, believing that it kept the water calm for the rest of the work. Another woman shakes her head, saying that in her family they spoke loudly over the well to scare away any lurking spirits. Historians still argue whether such practices were widespread, or simply the sort of personal habits that become rules after enough repetition. The bucket comes up again, heavier this time, the rope creaking under its weight. You take it with both hands, feeling the cool, damp seep into your skin, and pour slowly into your jar. The clay gives off its own faint, earthy scent as it accepts the water, and a bead of it rolls down the side, darkening the surface in a thin line. Carrying the jar home is slower work than filling it. You keep your steps measured, letting the water shift gently inside without slapping against the sides. The narrow lane is dappled with sunlight and shadow, and each patch of shade feels like a small gift. A boy passes you at a run, balancing a smaller pot in both hands. His bare feet slap the stones in quick, sure bursts. When you reach the courtyard, the jar is set beside a larger copper pot, already half full. Someone dips a ladle and tastes the water as though it were wine, nodding at its freshness. It will be used for cooking, for washing vegetables, and for the inevitable cups pressed into guests' hands on hot afternoons. Before you leave, another neighbor asks if you'll make one more trip. The path to the well is familiar now, and you agree, thinking of how many more jars will be filled in the coming days. The wedding will drink deeply, and the well, steady as the stone that holds it, will keep giving until the last guest leaves. You notice the rug because the corner curls just enough to catch your toe. It lies across the courtyard threshold, its faded reds and browns arranged in a pattern of small diamonds that once shouted, but now murmur. You kneel and press the corner flat. The nap strokes smooth beneath your hand, then lifts again once your weight leaves. Along the edge, the warp threads have frayed into a thin fringe of small anxieties. You fetch your basket of mending things needle, twine waxed thread, thimble polished to a crescent. A plain fact, in 19th century Greece, woven rugs were often dowry pieces, moved between benches, beds, and doorways, lasting decades, because people mended them rather than letting the edges tell the story before the center had finished speaking. You turn the rug to expose the warp ends, pale as bone. A bone needle takes a length of wool saved for such work. The first stitch is a promise under, over, under sliding, with a faint whisper through the old fibers. The rug is heavier than it looks, its weight stored in years of dust and footsteps. Light angles across your lap. A small bowl of water waits to dampen threads so they lie quiet. A child leans close and asks if you are sewing the earth back together. You tell her you are only persuading it to behave. She offers a red thread for luck, a habit some women kept to turn aside ill will. You set it aside for the final knot, not because you believe, but because it pleases her. You work along the border, matching warp to weft, pressing every few inches to test for give. The patterned diamond has softened into the colors of afternoon stone and watered wine. From inside the house comes the soft thud of almonds being chopped. A donkey complains somewhere beyond the wall. Historians still argue whether such motifs carried protective meaning, or were simply the weaver's practiced geometry. Some say blessings were knotted into every shape. Others hear only the rhythm of habit. You catch a weak spot and lay a support thread along it, shallow stitches binding it to the backing. Dust rises in a polite cloud each time you shake the rug to seat your work. A neighbor steps through the gate, lifting her feet high as if to avoid tripping over your task. She leaves a bundle of time on the wall before moving on. The child returns, asking how many stitches make a rug safe. You tell her it depends on the feet. She arranges 3 almonds and a raisin beside you, as her own kind of border. Another plain fact. Repairs before a wedding extended to rugs, hems, and tablecloths. Maintenance was a quiet declaration that the household knew how to care for what it owned. You come to the last inch and thread the red strand beneath, half hidden, a secret ember against the worn wool. You smooth the corner once more. It lies down as if remembering how. For finishing, you warm a pebble in the sun and press the seam, then pinch it dry between cloth, whispering the old phrase your mother used for all mending: be useful, be quiet. Rising, you test the threshold with your own feet forward. Back, nothing catches. The rug's border runs true again, ready for the night's procession of shoes and skirts. You return the mending basket to its corner, thimble winking in the bottom. the red thread coiled for another day. Sometimes, surviving wedding week is no more complicated than this. Put the edge back where it belongs, and everything crossing it will behave a little better. You step into the storeroom, where the air is cooler and smells faintly of cork, wood, and the shadowed sweetness of wine resting in casks. A small group of neighbors stands in a loose semicircle around a row of barrels, each with a cup in hand. Their faces are serious in the way only tasting can make them brows drawn, lips pursed, eyes narrowing as they tilt the liquid toward the light. A plain fact, in 19th century Greek villages, wine for a wedding was rarely bought outright. It came from household stores, from neighbors' contributions, or from a blend of both. The generosity of each family measured as much in flavor as in quantity. Deciding how much is enough was as much about pride as about arithmetic. One man tips a little from a narrow-spouted jug into your cup. The wine is the color of late summer plums, holding the light just long enough to hint at its depth before letting it through. You take a slow sip. It is warm from the cask, carrying the faint grip of the grape skins, along with the earthiness of the cellar. Someone nearby murmurs approval. Another asks if it's too strong for the older guests. The discussion begins in earnest. Which casks to open first? Which to hold back for later in the evening? How to keep the supply flowing without leaving a gap in the music? One woman insists that a sweeter wine should be offered early, so people speak kindly before they've even eaten. A man counters that stronger wine belongs at the start, to loosen everyone for dancing. The debate is gentle but unyielding, looping back on itself like a well-worn story. A fringe superstition emerges. An older man says it's unlucky to count the exact number of casks allowed, lest the wine grow shy and run out too soon. Instead, he counts by touching the hoops of each barrel in turn, muttering a rhyme under his breath. Another says this is nonsense, but still watches him do it without interruption. Historians still argue whether such customs were real beliefs or simply the cellar keeper's way of looking important. You watch as they draw another cup, this time from a lighter, amber-hued wine that smells faintly of apples. It's softer on the tongue, with less bite, but it leaves a pleasant warmth in the chest. Someone notes that this would suit the later hours, when the air cools and voices are already raised from dancing. The question of quantity remains. One man does a quick calculation in the dust with his finger cups per cask, guests per hour, hours until dawn, then shakes his head, as if the numbers are unreliable companions. Another offers a different solution. Keep one cask hidden for emergencies, meaning for when the dancing is too good to end. Your turn at the spigot comes again, and you taste the red once more, imagining how it will feel in the courtyard, with music in the air and plates passing from hand to hand. It is generous without being showy, the sort of wine that asks for company rather than applause. Finally, a loose agreement is reached. The red will flow first, the amber later, and the hidden cask will wait in the corner like a guest who knows when to speak. The cellar door is closed, the cool dimness sealing the wine into its rest until the day calls it out again. As you step back into the light, you can still taste the faint tannin on your tongue, a reminder that the measure of wine is never only in liters, but in the laughter it can stretch over the hours. Surviving wedding week, you think, means trusting that enough is sometimes a little more than you planned, and that the right sip at the right moment can keep the night turning. By late afternoon, the bride's courtyard has begun to resemble a small guest house rather than a family home. Bundles of blankets and folded quilts have appeared in every available corner, each one marked with a sprig of dried rosemary or a ribbon to remind the owner which is theirs. The smell of wool, linen, and faint lavender hangs in the air, warm from the day's sun and the press of many hands arranging them. A plain fact. In 19th century Greek villages, wedding week often meant visitors sleeping wherever space could be found, on benches, on rugs, in side rooms, or even in the sheltered corners of the courtyard. Beds were offered to the eldest or to guests from farthest away. Everyone else made do with whatever corner could be cleared and padded. You help drag a carved wooden chest to the far wall, so that a woven mat can be laid in its place. The mat smells faintly of rushes and the sea breeze it has been drying in. A boy unrolls another mat nearby, giving it a few brisk shakes before pressing it flat with his palms. The dust it raises drifts lazily toward the open doorway, and escapes into the lane. One woman spreads a blanket patterned with faded stripes, the weave thick and warm. Another follows with a pillow that has clearly seen years of use, its case patched in two different fabrics. They place it at the head of the mat and nod in silent agreement that it will be enough for the cousin arriving tomorrow. In one corner, a fringe practice is quietly observed. A handful of wheat is scattered under a blanket for good rest, a habit one aunt says keeps away bad dreams. Another aunt rolls her eyes but allows it to remain, saying that at least it smells pleasant. Historians still argue whether such gestures were once widespread customs or simply small comforts passed down in certain households. The younger children are given the task of carrying folded quilts from the neighboring house. They stagger under the weight, stopping every few steps to rest and laugh, the quilt swallowing them almost entirely. When they drop them in the courtyard, the fabric slumps like sleeping animals, and the children tumble onto them until someone claps hands for them to move along. The main room is already lined with makeshift sleeping places, mats, rugs, and narrow wooden couches, padded with whatever could be spared. An older man examines the arrangement and declares that it will fit more than you think, which usually means more than anyone would consider comfortable. Still, there is a certain skill in folding bodies into the available space without leaving gaps. As the sun lowers, shadows slip across the walls and the smell of roasting meat drifts in from another part of the village. Someone lights a small oil lamp in the corner, and its glow settles on the layered fabrics, turning their muted colors warmer. A neighbor arrives with 2 more pillows and a folded wool cover, placing them near the door for whichever latecomers arrive without bedding of their own. By the time you step back into the lane, the courtyard looks ready for a quiet invasion. Every surface that could hold a sleeping body now waits in stillness, the air holding a hush that will not last. In a few days, these blankets and mats will be scattered, rumpled, and faintly scented with the mingled perfumes of wine, sweat, and rosemary. For now they wait, breathing only the slow dust of the evening. You return to find 2 women bent over a rough plank balanced on a stool, their heads nearly touching as they speak in low, deliberate tones. On the plank is a scattering of small shards of pottery, each one serving as a name marker, the edges smoothed by years of handling. The women are arranging and rearranging them, each shard scratched with initials, as if the whole wedding could be solved like a puzzle if only the right pieces touched. A plain fact, in 19th century Greek villages, seating at a wedding feast was not left to chance. Where people sat could determine whether the night flowed with easy talk or became an evening of careful silences. Old quarrels were remembered, family ties weighed, and alliances quietly reinforced through the placement of chairs. You lean closer, reading the initials scratched into the pottery, some neat and clear, others hurried, the glaze still faintly visible in the grooves. The women push one shard a little farther down the plank, then move another in to take its place. They pause often, tilting their heads toward the courtyard, as if listening for trouble in the air already. One mentions, in a half-whisper, that certain cousins cannot sit too near each other, not because they will argue aloud, but because they will let the silence between them grow so thick it will sour the table. Another says that so-and-so's brother must be seated within sight of the wine jugs, or he will spend the evening wandering and blocking the serving lanes. A fringe belief is mentioned almost as an afterthought. One woman says that placing a mirror at the head table, angled to reflect the guests, will keep tempers in check. Another laughs but admits she's seen it done, though whether it worked or simply amused people is still unclear. Historians still argue whether such arrangements were ever recorded in formal etiquette, or were simply the unwritten strategies of those who remembered the last bad seating. You offer to help, and are given a small stack of new shards to scratch with initials. The pointed end of a nail does the work easily, the letters appearing pale against the dull brown surface. You find yourself wondering which of these small pieces will hold a story after the feast, who will trade places, who will stay put, who will forget entirely where they were meant to be. The plank fills with the names, forming 2 long lines with deliberate gaps for serving space. The women step back, squinting as if they can already see the night in motion, hands reaching for bread, heads bent close over talk, the slow leaning back after wine is poured. They change 3 pieces near the center, then swap 2 at the far end, muttering that it will have to do. A boy appears, sent to carry the seating plan to the men arranging the tables. He lifts the plank carefully, the charge shifting just enough to make everyone hold their breath, then trots away down the lane. Left alone in the quiet, you picture the feast to come, the way a misplaced seat could change the current of conversation, how a well-placed one could keep laughter flowing into the small hours. Surviving wedding week, you think, is partly about food and music, but just as much about knowing where to put people, so the evening's warmth lasts until the last candle burns low. The first scent reaches you before the sight meat turning slowly over coals, its surface kissed to gold, fat hissing where it drips into the fire. You follow the smell to the edge of the courtyard, where 3 long spits are set over a bed of glowing embers. Men stand nearby, turning the handles with the calm, unhurried rhythm of people who know they will be here for hours. A plain fact, in 19th century Greek villages, lamb was the centerpiece of many wedding feasts, roasted whole over an open fire. The process began early in the day and went on into the night, the slow turning and basting as much a part of the ritual as the eating itself. The lambs have already been rubbed with oil and herbs, oregano, rosemary, and thyme, each green leaf pressed into the skin until the scent has merged with the meat. As the spit turns, the surface glistens in the late light, a sheen that makes the air around it heavy with promise. One man dips a bundle of fresh herbs into a bowl of oil and brushes it over the roasting lamb, the sizzle sharp and brief before fading into the crackle of the fire. You are handed a clay cup of wine and told to stand close enough to smell, not close enough to sweat. The heat radiates in gentle waves, carrying with it the mingled scents of wood smoke and fat. It clings to your hair and clothes, the kind of smell that will follow you for the rest of the evening whether you eat or not. A fringe superstition surfaces. One man claims the spit must never turn backward, even by accident, or the meat will remember the reversal and be tough. Another scoffs, saying the only thing that makes it tough is rushing it. Historians still argue whether such beliefs were widespread wisdom or simply a cook's way of keeping bystanders from interfering. Now and then, a small flare rises where the oil drips, licking the meat with a brief, brighter heat. One of the men sprinkles a pinch of coarse salt over the surface as it turns, the grains bouncing and vanishing into the browned crust. The rhythm is hypnotic. Turn, baste, turn, salt. The conversation among the cooks is slow, broken by long pauses, in which they seem to be listening to the fire. Children hover just outside the heat's reach, drawn by the smell but warned back by a glance from the men. They amuse themselves by pretending to turn invisible spits, hands mimicking the steady motion, lips moving in silent imitation of the older men's talk. In the background, someone begins to tune a fiddle again, the notes winding their way into the courtyard. The men turning the spits do not react, but their shoulders settle into a slightly easier rhythm, as if the music has loosened the weight of the handles in their hands. A tray of bread is brought out and set nearby, each loaf still warm from the oven. The cooks break small pieces and use them to mop up the drippings collected in a shallow pan. You are offered one, and the taste is both sharp from the herbs and mellow from the slow rendering of the fat. It is enough to make you forget for a moment that the lamb still has hours to go. The light fades slowly, the coals deepening to a richer red. A man adds a split log to the fire's edge, the wood catching with a hiss before joining the steady glow. Soon the courtyard will fill with more people, drawn by this smell, and the men at the spits will hand over their work to the next shift. You step back, letting the warmth slide off your skin, and glance once more at the lambs turning steadily in the firelight. Surviving wedding week, you think, is made easier by knowing that somewhere in the village, something is roasting just for you, whether you're hungry yet or not. From the lane, you can hear the low murmur of women's voices, steady and unbroken, like a quiet river. You step through the open doorway and into a room heavy with the faint scent of rosewater and warm oil. At the center, the bride sits on a low stool, her hair divided into 3 thick sections that spill almost to her waist. Around her, 4 women work in a slow choreography, combing, braiding, smoothing, each movement deliberate, as if time itself has stretched to make space for this. A plain fact, in 19th century Greek villages, a bride's hair was often arranged over several hours, woven into braids that spoke of patience, skill, and the hands of women who knew the patterns by memory. It was as much an act of blessing as of beauty, a way of sending her into the wedding, wrapped in the work of her kin. One woman dips her fingers into a small clay bowl of oil, rubbing it into the strands until they shine softly in the dim light. Another combs through a section, the teeth of the comb whispering as they travel from root to tip. The sound repeats, slow and soothing, punctuated by the faint creak of the stool beneath the bride. A fringe superstition is quietly observed. One of the women slips a single dried basil leaf into the center braid, hidden deep where it will not be seen. She says it will keep envy away from the bride on her wedding day. Another smiles but says nothing, her fingers busy, weaving a thinner braid to wrap around the base of the first. Historians still argue whether such tokens were charms passed down from older, pre-Christian customs, or simply gestures of comfort dressed up as tradition. The braiding is unhurried, the pace set not by the clock, but by the steady exchange of stories. The women speak of other weddings whose hair took longest, whose braids stayed neat until morning, whose came loose before the second song. The bride listens with a faint, private smile, her eyes lowered, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Every so often, a child peeks in through the doorway, stands on tiptoe to see, and is gently shooed away. The room is not for play today. It is for the quiet work that must be done without interruption. Even the air seems to move more slowly here, as if the dust motes themselves have agreed not to hurry. The main braid grows heavier as it lengthens, coiling like a rope down the bride's back. It is bound at intervals with narrow ribbons, red, then gold, then white, each tied in a small, firm knot. When the ribbons are pulled tight, the braid sways slightly, settling into its final shape. One woman begins the last task, weaving a fine chain of smaller braids across the crown of the bride's head, joining them at the back with a small bronze pin shaped like a pomegranate. The metal catches the light, a quick flash before it is hidden again beneath the folds of hair. When the work is done, the bride's hair looks both intricate and solid, ready to withstand the hours of dancing and greeting to come. The women step back, wiping their hands on their aprons, their faces carrying the satisfaction of a job finished well. The bride touches the braid lightly, not to adjust it, but to feel the weight of it, the way it anchors her head. The room breathes again. The low talk resumes in a lighter tone. The story is now drifting toward what the night will bring. Someone pours cool water into a clay cup and hands it to the bride. She drinks slowly, her ribbons catching the faint breeze from the open door. As you step out into the lane, the smell of rosewater follows you, lingering in the air like a thin thread, tying you back to the room. Surviving wedding week, you think, depends as much on these hours of deliberate stillness as on all the bustle outside. A braid bound with care will hold longer than any song. The courtyard is lively, but edged with the kind of urgency that comes when the sun has begun to dip and something important has been forgotten. A boy runs past you, bare feet quick on the stone, a shallow wooden tray held high in both hands. You catch the scent before you see what's missing: briny, sharp, and faintly fruity. Olives. A plain fact. In 19th century Greek villages, olives were more than just food during a wedding feast. They were a table's anchor, a constant companion to bread, cheese, and wine. A wedding table without its olives would be whispered about, not with cruelty, but with the mild disbelief reserved for something as unusual as bread without salt. The boy is heading to a neighbor's house, where a large ceramic jar sits in the shade of a storeroom wall. When you follow, you see him pause to wipe his hands on his shirt before lifting the lid. The air under it is cool and heavy with the smell of brine. The olives lie beneath a shallow layer of oil, black and green together, their skins wrinkled from curing, glistening like wet stones pulled from a riverbed. He uses a slotted wooden spoon to lift them into the tray, the brine dripping back in thin rivulets. The sound is soft but distinct, a slow patter that could be mistaken for rain on a hollow roof. He works quickly, but not carelessly. A single olive dropped on the ground is rinsed in a bowl of water and tucked back into the pile without fuss. A fringe superstition comes from the woman watching him. She warns that if the tray is filled too high, guests will take more than they should, leaving the last bowl on the table nearly empty before the main course arrives. Better, she says, to refill often, so the olives don't feel abandoned. Historians still argue whether such sayings were rooted in thrift, in the rhythm of serving, or in the human tendency to give inanimate things a kind of mood. The boy sprinkles a few sprigs of oregano over the olives, crushing them slightly in his fist to release their scent. He drizzles a thin line of fresh oil from a narrow-mouthed jug, enough to make the surfaces gleam in the fading light. The tray now looks ready for its place among the bread baskets and cheese boards waiting in the courtyard. He sets off at a brisk walk, careful to keep the tray level. You follow at a slower pace, noticing how the late light picks out the curve of each olive, the way the oil pools briefly in their dimples before sliding away. By the time you arrive, the boy has already set the tray on a low table, and a small knot of people stands nearby, drawn by the scent. Someone spears one on the tip of a small knife, holding it up to the light before eating it. The approval is silent but obvious. The knife returns for another. The tray will not be full for long. As you step back, you catch the briny scent again, sharper now in the cooler air of evening. Surviving wedding week, you think, depends on knowing that small things, like a tray of olives, arriving at just the right moment, can keep the whole table in harmony until the first platter of lamb is set down. By the time the lamps are lit, the narrow lanes leading to the main square feel like a slow-moving river of people. Neighbors carry stools, benches, and the occasional mismatched chair, each balanced in practiced hands or tied with twine across a shoulder. The scrape of wood against stone mixes with low voices and the faint, constant background of fiddles being tuned somewhere ahead. A plain fact, in 19th-century Greek villages, wedding seating in public squares was often borrowed from every available home. Chairs and benches would travel the short distance between houses and gathering places so often during wedding week that some bore permanent scratches from the journey. You join a small group carrying a long wooden bench whose legs wobble slightly with each step. The bench smells faintly of smoke and old polish, the scent that clings to furniture kept near a hearth. As you walk, someone behind you hums a slow tune, keeping time with the steps in a way that makes the carrying easier. In the square, the first rows of seating have already been placed close to the musician's platform. The best spots close enough to see the fiddler's fingers, far enough to avoid being pressed into dancing too soon, are reserved for the elders. You and the others set the bench down in the second row, adjusting its legs so they don't wobble too much on the uneven stones. A fringe superstition comes to light as you work. One man insists that all chairs must face the same direction before the feast begins, or the night will be filled with crosstalk and misunderstandings. Another counters that people will talk across the rows no matter what you do, but still helps adjust the bench to align with the others. Historians still argue whether such beliefs were rooted in a sense of order, a desire for symmetry, or simply the instinct to keep everyone looking toward the music. More benches arrive, some narrow and simple, others carved along the edges with faint patterns nearly worn away by years of use. Chairs are wedged into any gaps, their legs angled to fit the space. A few stools are set near the edges for those who will get up often to help serve food or wine. The square takes on the look of an open-air room, its walls invisible but felt in the way the seating shapes the space. The air smells faintly of dust stirred by moving furniture, layered now with the sharper scents of roasting meat and baking bread drifting in from the courtyards. You pause to watch a boy test each bench by sitting on it briefly, bouncing once, and nodding if it holds. When he finds one that wobbles, he wedges a thin chip of stone under the leg until it stands firm. It is a small act of care that will go unnoticed by most, but will spare someone the distraction of a tilted seat later in the night. By the time you step back from the square, the lanes are quieter, the last of the furniture in place. The benches and chairs stand in their rows, waiting for the sound of the first song to draw the crowd in. Surviving wedding week, you think, is partly a matter of comfort, but it's also about the way a village can turn a collection of borrowed seats into a place where the night will unfold, as if it belonged there all along. In the low light of the courtyard, the musicians begin to gather. Their instruments are carried in worn cases, wrapped in cloth, or simply held by hand as if the road between home and here is too short to bother with protection. They greet one another with brief nods, their voices quiet but threaded with the satisfaction of arriving on time. A plain fact, in 19th century Greek villages, wedding music was not merely background, It was a living guide for the evening. The musicians set the pace for eating, talking, and dancing. Their cues as important as the serving of food. You watch as a violin is lifted from its cloth wrap, the wood catching a warm gleam from a nearby lamp. The fiddler turns the peg slowly, plucking each string, the sound dry and thin until it falls into place. A clarinet follows, its reed tested with a few short, reedy phrases that swirl briefly through the air before disappearing into the evening. A fringe superstition is shared almost in passing. One of the older men says the first tune played must be a slow, steady one to bind the guests' feet, so they stay until morning. Another musician laughs and replies that the only thing that binds guests is good wine. But he still sets his bow to the strings with care, as if the choice of the first song matters. Historians still argue whether such ideas ever shaped the order of the music, or were simply affectionate habits dressed up as tradition. The air around the musicians begins to hum with fragments of sound, short runs of notes, a chord tested and retested, the soft tap of fingers against drumskin. A small boy is given the task of holding the drum for a moment while its owner adjusts the tension. The boy's eyes widen at the deep thrum that follows when the player tests it. The instruments settle into readiness. The fiddler plays a brief melody that winds upward like smoke, and the others join in almost without looking at one another. It is not the start of the night's music, only a shared breath to align themselves, but it shifts the air in the courtyard all the same. Nearby, the seating has begun to fill with those who want to watch the musicians prepare. An older woman adjusts her scarf and leans forward on her stool, listening as if she can already tell how the evening will go by the sound of the warm-up. A jug of wine appears at the musicians' table, poured into small cups that are left untouched for now. The fiddler glances at it once, then back to his strings, plucking them gently as the last light fades from the sky. When they pause, the air feels expectant. The conversations in the square lower slightly, waiting for the moment when the first tune will take hold. Surviving wedding week, you think, is impossible without this, without the promise of music to stitch the hours together, without the quiet certainty that the first notes will tell everyone, in their own way, that the night has begun. The first notes rise slowly, almost shyly, curling into the warm night air before finding their strength. A fiddle leads, drawing out a melody that is both familiar and just a little slower than usual, as if coaxing the crowd into stillness. The clarinet joins, its tone weaving beneath the violin like a low river under a bridge. The drum follows last, a steady, rounded heartbeat that settles into the space between steps and breaths. A plain fact, in 19th century Greek villages, the opening music at a wedding was as much about signaling readiness as it was about entertainment. It told the cooks when to start bringing out the first plates, told the dancers when to gather their courage, and told the latecomers that they had better slip in quietly. You watch from the edge of the square as people lean closer to one another, their conversations briefly stilled so they can catch the tune. It's not a call to dance yet, only an invitation to let the mind drift toward it. The rhythm is steady but unhurried, each beat spaced just enough to give the music room to breathe. A fringe belief comes to mind from a woman at your side. She says the first song of a wedding should last exactly as long as it takes the moon to clear the edge of the rooftops. Any shorter, and the night will end too soon. Any longer, and guests will grow restless before the dancing truly begins. Historians still argue whether such timing was ever deliberate, or if it was simply the poetry of watching sky and music share a moment. As the tune continues, you notice the small changes, the fiddler's bow pressing a little deeper into the string, the clarinet stretching its notes into softer curves, the drum slipping in an extra beat here and there like a quiet flourish. Children begin to sway in place, their feet not yet moving but their shoulders tilting to the rhythm. From the far side of the square, a man claps once, sharp and precise, before joining in time with the drum. Others follow, the sound spreading until it feels like the whole square has taken a single breath together. The musicians do not look up, but you can tell they feel it. The melody leans forward just slightly, like someone stepping into a doorway. Plates begin to appear at the edges of the crowd, small, simple offerings of bread, cheese, and olives, passed from hand to hand. The music wraps around the scent of warm bread, folding it into the evening until you can't tell where the sound ends and the smell begins. The moon does indeed slip free of the rooftops, just as the final notes of the tune fade into the night. There's a pause then, a breath held in common, before the musicians turn the page in their minds and begin the next song, one with more movement in its bones. Surviving Wedding Week, you think, is about knowing how to start, not with a shout or a rush, but with a slow unfolding. The way music can open a night like a flower, opening its petals to the lamplit air. By the time the second tune settles into its rhythm, the space between the benches has begun to shift. People stand, step forward, and take each other's hands with the kind of quiet formality that precedes a shared dance. There is no rush. The circle grows one pair at a time, each new dancer finding a place at the end, adjusting their grip so the line remains unbroken. A plain fact: in 19th century Greek villages, the opening dances of a wedding were often slow, communal steps that allowed everyone, from the youngest to the oldest, to join without strain. It was not about showing skill, but about binding the village into one moving shape. The first steps are simple: left, right, a small sway forward and back. Feet barely leave the ground, the movement more a shift of weight than a lift. The rhythm makes it easy for conversation to continue, for laughter to slip in without disturbing the flow. A fringe superstition is murmured by a man beside you. He says that if someone stumbles during the first dance, they must be gently pulled toward the center and given a sip of wine before they rejoin. Otherwise, the night's dances will be full of small missteps. Historians still argue whether this was a real cure or simply an excuse to share the first drink of the evening. From the edge, you watch the line lengthen until it curves into a near circle. The fiddler leans into the melody, adding a little lilt to each phrase. The clarinet smooths the space between beats like a brush over rough wood. The drum holds steady, giving the dancers something firm to press their feet against. Children dart in and out at the edges, trying to mimic the steps without being noticed. One girl, braver than the rest, slips into the line between two laughing women, who simply tighten their grip and pull her along until she moves in time. The circle turns slowly, more a gentle drift than a true spin, and the sound of shoes on stone is a low, steady whisper beneath the music. Faces pass you again and again, each one changed slightly by the rhythm, more open, more settled, more at ease. As the tune nears its end, the dancers slow without stopping, the last few steps landing like a sigh. Hands unclasp, but no one walks away. They simply shift into smaller groups, talking in low voices as the musicians pause to retune. The air now feels warmer, not from the heat of the day, but from the shared motion, the way a slow dance can knit people together without a single word. Surviving Wedding Week, you think, is about finding your place in that circle, whether your feet join the steps or you simply stand close enough to feel the rhythm pass through you. Morning comes as if it has been waiting just around the corner, patient and unsurprised. The square is quiet, the benches no longer pressed close by knees, the chairs angled in small tired poses, as if they have fallen asleep where they stood. You walk through the lanes at a slow, considerate pace, noticing the aftermath, the way one reads a letter written in a familiar hand, crumbs like punctuation marks on the stones. A ribbon escaped from someone's hair, a sprig of basil flattened, where a heel must have landed during the last dance. A plain fact: in 19th century Greek villages, weddings ended not with a curtain drop, but with the unglamorous, communal collecting of what had been borrowed, and the careful tucking away of what had been displayed. The end was a process, not an hour, and everyone understood their part. You begin with the tables. The planks come up with low groans, as if waking from a long nap. Trestles are folded and leaned against the wall, their knobby feet showing powdery crescents where they pressed into stone. Someone slides a damp cloth along each board, lifting the thin sheen of oil and the faint outline where bowls once sat. A young cousin taps two nails free and pockets them, the small ritual of any dismantling. From the kitchens drift the sounds of quiet industry. Pots being rinsed, copper wiped back to its dim shine, a ladle held up to the light to admire the familiar grain of its wood despite the new smoke caught in it. You touch your own borrowed ladle's handle when it returns and say nothing about the shallow scrape near the rim. It has earned another story, and you will not scold it for that. Olives have left their brine-dark fingerprints on trays. Bread baskets are turned upside down to shake the last seeds free. In a shaded room, the candles are counted again, fewer by several. but enough remained to say the night was well lit. A woman murmurs that the silent count worked. Another counters that the night would have held regardless. Historians still argue whether calm nights belong to custom or to luck, but the basket of unburned tapers looks content with its share of credit. Chairs begin their slow pilgrimage home. They squeak along the stones in twos and threes, guided by small armies of children who know exactly which chair belonged to which doorway. A boy rests his chin on the back of your reed stool and announces that it did not wobble once, which is almost true. You accept the compliment and the stool, running your thumb over the corner you tightened just before the feast. The musicians pass by like ordinary men again, cases shut, instruments hidden. They walk lighter than when they arrived, pockets heavier by a few coins and small kindnesses tucked in by grateful hands. One fiddler lifts his free palm in a brief salute that says, "Until the next wedding, may your lanes be restful." In the bride's house, the hairpins are counted back into a little dish, their bronze heads tapping softly against each other. The pomegranate pin lies apart, turned once in the light before it is wrapped in cloth. Aunties unknot ribbons and smooth them over a hand, coiling each length with the carefulness of women who have seen cloth outlast tempers and seasons. The dowry display is unbuilt with a courtesy that mirrors the pride with which it was arranged. Linens return to the chest folded more loosely now, as if they have exhaled. A small clay jar with blue swirls is set back on a high shelf, its lid padded once like a child's shoulder. A neighbor lingers over the copper pot, catching her faded reflection, and admits to preferring the marks left by cooking to the brief applause of polish. From the edge of the square comes a long, satisfied sigh disguised as a broom on stone. You pick up your own broom and give the lane its afterthought tidying straw. Seed hulls, the confetti of almond skins that escaped every bowl. A fringed tidbit returns with your strokes. Some households would scatter a last pinch of wheat along the threshold after the feast, so the house remembers abundance. You do it without announcing it, just a small whisper of grain that looks like sunlight when it hits the ground. A last uncertainty lingers in conversation as neighbors lean against the familiar low wall. Was the second dance truly slower than the first, or did it only feel that way to those whose feet had grown tender? Did the moon crest the roofs precisely when the opening tune ended, or did memory edit the timing to suit the story? Historians still argue whether these details can be measured at all. The village decides gently that they cannot and need not. By midday, the square resembles itself again. The old man reclaims his chair by his doorway and declares the world restored to its proper arrangement. He lifts a cup of water and tastes the faint limestone of the well, as if judging a vintage. Children drift toward shade and small games. Women stand in doorways with hands empty for the first time in days, uncertain for a breath and then quietly pleased. You carry the last borrowed jug home, its lip still smelling faintly of wine, and set it on the shelf beside the others. It takes its old place without wanting ceremony. You touch each vessel as if taking attendance, then tap the veteran twice in thanks. The sound small and friendly in the cool room. Evening will be an ordinary evening. There will be bread and perhaps a small dish of the leftover wheat, sweetened with the last of the chopped nuts, and the kind of talk that makes no decisions. When music floats faintly up from some distant courtyard, it will feel like a dream you can keep or let pass. Surviving wedding week, you think, is mostly the art of folding the village back into its daily size without losing the extra kindness it grew to hold. You close the door as the lane grows quiet, and the house, relieved and content, settles back onto its stones. The village sighs into its ordinary shape. You sit where the breeze can find you, and let the quiet do what it always does. After long days, it drifts into corners and settles there like cool water in a shallow bowl. The broom rests against the wall, its bristles softened by use. The jugs keep their clay, cool silence. The chairs stand at their customary angles, as if nothing remarkable ever asked them to travel. A fig leaf taps the lintel in a lazy rhythm. Somewhere, a pot lid clicks once as it finds its seat. You let your eyes follow the familiar lines. The hairline crack in the plaster above the window, the pale oval on the floor where a basket usually sits, the faint thread of basil scent that seems to cling to everything now. No grand tasks remain, only the small gestures that make a room feel tended: the fold of a cloth, the straightening of a spoon, the brief touch to a jug's handle as you pass. Voices travel thinly from far away. Stretched by the evening, they arrive as murmurs without words and fade before they can become questions. The lamp is low. Its light lays a soft, amber edge along the table and stops there, content not to fill the room. Your breathing chooses the pace the night prefers. The day puts away its sharper tools and keeps only what is smooth. You imagine the square empty, the sea breathing at the quay, the moon taking its slow, practiced path above roofs that have seen more weddings than anyone can remember. Everything important has been returned, or will be. What remains will find its place tomorrow. You tilt your head against the wall, feeling its stone certainty under the lime. Sleep is near, drawn by old rhythms it trusts. When it comes, it will be like stepping into a room you know in the dark, no surprises, only space enough to rest. We hope this glimpse into old customs has been a calm and pleasant one. If it made you curious for more, you can like, share, or leave a kind comment. And if you wish, subscribe to be here for the next unhurried tradition we explore together. End of script. Sweet dreams.